A man was shot twice in the head and left in a shallow grave in the Mojave Desert. He did not die. That was the beginning of the most important political conflict the post-war world had ever seen. A courier, a gambling chip the size of a palm, a man in a checkered suit who smiled while he pulled the trigger, 2 bullets in the skull, a hole in the ground, and a story that was supposed to end before it began. It did not end. That is what makes it worth telling. The grave was shallow, the desert was cold, and somewhere beneath the dirt, something that should have been finished was still breathing. Nevada, in the final years before the bombs, was not the kind of place that appeared on lists of strategic importance. The western states carried the weight of government, industry, and military command. The eastern seaboard held the monuments. Nevada held the sand, the heat, and the long stretches of highway connecting places people passed through on their way to somewhere else. Las Vegas was the exception. It had always been the exception. By the 2060s, the city had become something stranger than its reputation suggested. The casinos were still operating, the lights were still burning through every desert night, and the tourists still arrived by the thousands. But the men who owned those buildings were not the men who had built them. The ownership had quietly shifted. The Strip, in its entirety, had been purchased by a single individual, a technology magnate named Robert Edwin House, whose company, Robco Industries, had produced half the computing infrastructure that ran pre-war America. He had bought Las Vegas not out of sentiment and not for profit. He had bought it because he intended it to survive. House had spent 15 years running probability models on the trajectory of global conflict. The math kept producing the same result. Nuclear war was not a possibility. It was a scheduled event. The only variable was the date, and he had narrowed that down to a window of 2 years with a confidence margin that no government agency had been willing to take seriously. He did not waste time trying to convince them. The preparations were conducted quietly. 77 missile defense towers were installed at calculated positions surrounding the city. Not government contracts, not military installations, but privately funded architecture disguised as utility structures. Each one was programmed with targeting systems House had designed personally, calibrated to intercept warheads at the specific trajectories his models predicted. He also negotiated with the military to keep the region deliberately light on strategic infrastructure, reducing Las Vegas's value as a target. The casinos were reinforced. The Lucky 38, his personal tower on the Strip, was sealed and connected to a life support system he had engineered to sustain him through whatever followed. The air, on the 23rd of October, 2077, had that particular quality that sometimes precedes catastrophic events, a stillness that registered in the body before the mind could name it. 9 warheads reached the outer edge of the city's defensive perimeter. All 9 were intercepted. The explosions happened in the upper atmosphere, silent from the street, visible as brief flashes in the afternoon sky. The city shook slightly, the power flickered, and then the lights came back on. Because Robert House had planned for exactly that too. Las Vegas did not burn, it went quiet. The tourists stopped arriving. The staff went home and did not return. The Strip's famous signs continued cycling through their programs, advertising shows and buffets to streets that had emptied completely. The sand outside the city limits was already beginning to carry the grey drift of fallout from the destruction elsewhere. But the buildings stood. The infrastructure held. The Lucky 38 sealed itself, and somewhere inside it, a man attached to a life support mainframe closed his eyes and began to wait. The world that had been ended. The city had not. What followed was not silence so much as a very long kind of forgetting. For the next 200 years, the irradiated flats of Nevada existed in a state between ruin and persistence. The settlements that formed around Las Vegas were small and desperate clusters of survivors building walls against the things that came out of the dark, scratching agriculture from soil that had never been particularly fertile and was now considerably worse. Raiders moved through the open territory in waves, claiming ground and losing it, and claiming it again in cycles that never resolved into anything permanent. The Lucky 38's lights stayed on through all of it. Travelers crossing the open ground at night could see the tower from miles away, its upper floors lit against the black sky like something from the old world that had refused to understand what had happened. No one went inside. The door did not open from the outside. The Securitron robots that occasionally patrolled the surrounding blocks did not explain themselves to anyone who asked. House was alive inside that tower. The life support held. His consciousness remained intact, though the isolation of 2 centuries had effects on a mind that even his own models had not fully accounted for. He watched the desert through his sensor network. He tracked the slow formation of new communities. He observed, with particular attention, the emergence of 2 organized powers pushing toward his city from opposite directions. From the west, the new California Republic had been building itself into something that resembled a government. It had a president, a Congress, a currency, and an army. It had been expanding for decades, absorbing settlements through trade agreements, military protection, and the kind of institutional momentum that made it easier to join than to resist. By the early 270s, its eastern advance had reached the Colorado River, and on the far side of that river stood the single most valuable piece of infrastructure in the region, Hoover Dam. The dam had survived the war in the same condition as Las Vegas, structurally intact. Its turbines still capable of generating electricity for an enormous surrounding territory, its water management systems still functional. The new California Republic's leadership understood immediately what holding the dam meant: electricity for hundreds of miles, control of the Colorado's water flow, a logistical anchor for the deepest eastern expansion the organization had ever attempted. They crossed the river and they took it, and they called this liberation. The soldiers who were sent to hold the dam were told they were bringing civilization back to a region that had been without it for 200 years. That framing was not entirely inaccurate. It was also not entirely complete. From the east, something was approaching that did not use the language of liberation at all. Caesar's legion had no interest in republics or elections or the slow accumulation of institutional trust. It had been built by a man who believed that those systems were precisely what had destroyed the old world, that the democratic tolerance of corruption and weakness was a death sentence written in policy language, and that only a civilization constructed on absolute discipline could actually last. The legion marched under a red banner. Its soldiers wore lorica segmentata, segmented metal armor, modeled on the armies of ancient Rome. They moved across the American Southwest in organized columns, absorbing tribal communities through conquest, burning the old world artifacts that the NCR collected and preserved, and leaving no ambiguity about what their arrival meant for the people in their path. By the late 270s, the eastern edge of Nevada had become a contact zone between these 2 advancing forces. Neither side had fully committed to a decisive engagement. The dam sat between them like a weight on a scale, and both sides understood that whoever held it controlled the region's most fundamental resource. The man in the Lucky 38 watched all of this and calculated. House needed one thing to be able to act, one thing that had been lost before he had been able to use it: a small data storage device, the platinum chip that he had commissioned from a manufacturing facility in 2077, a specialized piece of hardware containing a software upgrade for his entire Securitron network. With it, his robots would transform from basic security units into full military platforms, capable of matching anything the NCR or the Legion could field. Without it, his army was limited. Without it, he could manage the Strip, but could not project force beyond it. The chip had been in transit when the bombs fell. Its courier had never arrived. For 2 centuries, House had managed without it. He had been patient in the way that only someone with no other option learns to be. He had worked with what he had, the 3 gangs he had recruited to operate his casinos. the Securitrons he could deploy in their current configuration, the network of sensors that kept him informed of everything happening in the surrounding territory he had endured. Then, in 2281, through the kind of careful information gathering that 200 years of network access makes possible, he found it. The chip had survived. It had passed through various hands and various locations over the decades, and it was now traceable. He arranged for it to be collected and transported through the Mojave Express, a courier service operating across the desert with a final destination of the Lucky 38. The courier assigned to the final leg of that delivery was not selected for any particular distinction. They were simply the next person on the roster, the last link in a long chain. The delivery was supposed to be routine. A camp was established north of Good Springs, a small settlement sitting at the edge of the desert, its buildings worn by years of dry wind, and its population held together by the modest economies of survival. The courier arrived at the designated meeting point with the chip secured. They did not see the men waiting for them until it was too late. The figure who stepped forward was dressed in a checkered suit that had no business existing in a post-war desert. His name was Benny. He ran a casino operation called the Chairman inside the New Vegas Strip, and he had spent considerable time learning what the platinum chip actually was and what it was capable of doing. His conclusion had been simple. Delivering it to House would end any possibility of independence for anyone on the Strip. House's upgraded army would make resistance pointless. Benny had decided he would not deliver that outcome. He had a different plan, one that required the current courier to be permanently removed from the situation. 2 shots, close range. The desert absorbed the sound the way it absorbs everything completely, without acknowledgement. The body was placed in a shallow grave in the cemetery at the edge of Good Springs. The chip was taken. The men in Benny's employ moved quickly and quietly back toward the city. It was the kind of thing that happened in the desert and was never mentioned again, except that a Securitron unit designated Victor had been watching. Victor was one of House's mobile scouts, a robot in a yellow chassis whose face screen displayed a friendly cartoon, rendering of a cowboy hat and a broad mechanical smile. Victor had been tracking the chip's movement for some time. He had witnessed the ambush, and he had, with the particular practicality of a machine that understood its priorities, dug the courier out of the ground before the desert could finish what the bullets had started. The nearest shelter was Good Springs. Victor carried the courier there. A man named Mitchell, the settlement's doctor, operating out of a house, stocked with salvaged medical equipment and a knowledge base assembled from pre-war texts and years of field experience, assessed the damage. 2 bullets had been removed from the skull. The wounds were severe. The prognosis, in any conventional assessment, should have been final. Mitchell worked through the night. He used a device called a vigor tester to monitor neural activity and employed a virtual reality simulation to assess cognitive function during recovery. The courier survived. The specifics of that survival are not fully explainable by the medical knowledge Mitchell had available. Some things simply happen at the edges of what probability allows. When the courier opened their eyes, the ceiling of Mitchell's house was the first thing they saw. White painted wood, a water stain in one corner, the particular quality of desert light coming through a window that had not been cleaned in some time. Memory was absent. The ambush, the men, the chip, the man in the checkered suit, all of it was gone, replaced by the blank, clean surface of a mind that had been through something it had not yet processed. What remained was the Pip-Boy, attached to the left forearm, a personal computer from the old world, strapped on before the delivery, still functioning, and a residual awareness of direction. Someone had tried to kill them. That person was somewhere to the south. That was enough to begin with. Good Springs was quiet around them. The wind moved through the open spaces between buildings with the low, continuous sound of something that had been passing through this place for a very long time and intended to continue. The Brahmin large, two-headed cattle that had adapted to the irradiated landscape in ways that the biologists of the old world had not anticipated, shifted in their pen near the saloon. A water pump near the town's center moved with the slow mechanical rhythm of a system that had been kept running through decades of careful maintenance. The courier stood. The desert lay ahead. They did not yet know that a man in a tower had been waiting for them. They did not know that two armies were positioned on opposite sides of a river, each calculating the same moment. They did not know that the chip in Benny's possession was the last piece of a plan that had been constructed before either of those armies existed. They knew one thing: the man who had fired those shots had a name, and that name was moving south toward a city full of lights that had never gone dark. The first civilization to rise from the wreckage of old America did not announce itself. It began as a collection of tents arranged in a rough circle on the California flatlands, organized around the practical knowledge of a single woman who had walked out of a vault with seeds, medical supplies, and an understanding of water purification that no one else in the surrounding territory possessed. The settlement was called Shady Sands. Its founders were survivors of Vault 15, a facility whose overseer had released its population earlier than intended, scattering them into a world that had not yet decided whether it wanted to support human life again. The early years were defined by the specific hardships of people who understood what civilization was supposed to look like, but had to rebuild it from materials that barely qualified. Crops were planted in soil that required years of treatment before it would yield reliably. Water was filtered through systems assembled from salvaged components. Medicine was rationed, shared, and stretched across a population that grew faster than the resources available to it. Raiders pressed against the settlement's edges constantly, drawn by the smell of anything organized enough to be worth taking. Shady Sands held. The walls went up. The crops improved. Children were born who had never known the vault, who understood the flatlands as home rather than exile, and who grew into adults with practical skills suited to the world as it actually was, rather than the world their parents remembered. By the 2100 seconds, the settlement had expanded into something that required more than informal leadership to manage. A council was formed. Trade agreements were negotiated with neighboring communities. A militia was organized from the men and women who had demonstrated the particular combination of courage and restraint that defensive work demands. The circle of tents had become a town, and the town had begun to attract others, not because Shady Sands was wealthy or powerful, but because it was stable, and stability in the post-war landscape was the rarest thing there was. The air in those early council meetings carried the particular tension of people trying to build rules for situations the rules had not yet imagined. Growth brought complexity. Communities to the north and south were brought into the trading network, then into a more formal arrangement of mutual protection, then into something that required a name. In 2186, that name was declared: the New California Republic. A president was elected. A Congress was assembled from representatives of the member communities. A constitution was written, borrowing heavily from the pre-war document that several of its authors had studied from recovered texts, adapting its language to circumstances the original framers could not have anticipated. The Republic announced itself to the surrounding territory with a particular kind of confidence, the confidence of people who believed they had found the correct answer to the question of how civilization should be rebuilt, and who were prepared to extend that answer outward until it covered as much of the ruined continent as could be reached. Not every community received that extension as liberation. Vault City sat in the northern reaches of Nevada, its walls sealed and its attitudes firmly fixed. The settlement had been founded by the inhabitants of Vault 8, a facility whose Gek Garden of Eden creation kit, a terraforming device designed to accelerate environmental recovery, had been successfully activated, producing a small but genuinely prosperous enclave surrounded by functional technology and clean air. The people of Vault City did not consider themselves survivors. They considered themselves a continuation. Their genetic lines were unirradiated. Their medical knowledge was advanced. Their technology functioned. They had no particular interest in being absorbed into a republic that included communities they regarded as categorically inferior. The NCR's approach to Vault City was prolonged and uncomfortable. Direct annexation was not practical. The settlement's defensive capabilities and the political complications of forcibly absorbing a technically advanced community made that route inadvisable. What eventually occurred was closer to an exhausted negotiation. Vault City acknowledged NCR authority in exchange for arrangements that preserved its internal governance structure and kept its most sensitive technology out of the Republic's direct control. Neither side was satisfied. Both sides accepted the outcome as the least damaging available option. New Reno presented an entirely different challenge. The city had rebuilt itself around the industries that survive any collapse: intoxicants, gambling, and the organized management of both. 4 families ran its operations with the kind of efficiency that comes from decades of violent competition. The NCR could not easily absorb New Reno through military means without destroying the economic infrastructure that made the city worth absorbing in the first place. What happened instead was a slow gravitational pull: trade dependencies, debt arrangements, political marriages of convenience that eventually drew the city into the Republic's orbit without requiring a formal declaration from either side. New Reno joined the NCR the way most things joined it in its middle years, not from belief, but because the alternative had become more expensive than compliance. By the 2240s, the Republic stretched across 5 recognized states. It had paper currency accepted across hundreds of settlements. It had a standing army large enough to project force across enormous distances. It had courts, taxation, postal routes, and a bureaucracy that employed thousands of people whose entire lives were spent managing the administrative consequences of expansion. It also had Brahmin barons, wealthy ranching families, who had converted post-war survival into generational wealth and who used that wealth to shape legislative outcomes in their favor. It had water rights conflicts that turned neighboring communities into enemies. It had a military officer class that had grown accustomed to operating without significant civilian oversight. The democratic ideals that had been written into the Constitution remained on the page. Their relationship to daily governance had become, over the decades, increasingly theoretical. What the Republic built was real. What it cost to build it was also real. Those 2 facts sat beside each other in every NCR settlement, unresolved. From a completely different direction, something else was taking shape. In the late 2240s, a young man named Edward Sallow was traveling east of the Colorado River as part of a research expedition organized by the Followers of the Apocalypse. The Followers were a scholarly organization that had operated in the California wastes for decades, committed to the preservation and distribution of pre-war knowledge, medicine, agriculture, history, engineering. Sallow was a linguist. He had studied Latin from recovered academic texts, along with the history of classical civilizations, and had been assigned to document the tribal communities living in the regions beyond the Republic's eastern frontier. The expedition was captured by a tribe called the Blackfoot. They were engaged in a conflict with several neighboring groups and losing it by degrees, their tactics reactive, their numbers declining, their knowledge of organized warfare essentially non-existent. The other members of the expedition were held as bargaining leverage. Sallow assessed the situation with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years studying how power actually accumulates, rather than how it is supposed to work. He began teaching. The Blackfoot learned to set ambushes rather than charge. They learned to strike supply lines rather than fortified positions. They learned the difference between a battle that needed to be won and a position that simply needed to be abandoned. They began winning engagements they had previously lost automatically. Sallow watched this transformation with the focused attention of a man testing a hypothesis. The hypothesis confirmed itself faster than he had expected. He absorbed the defeated tribes into the Blackfoot rather than allowing their dispersal a decision borrowed from the Roman practice of incorporating conquered peoples, rather than simply eliminating them. He declared Latin the language of command, assigned Roman military ranks to his developing officer structure, and gave himself the name that he would carry for the rest of his life, not Edward Sallow, Caesar. 6 more tribes were absorbed over the following years, each conquest adding to the force that the next conquest required. The philosophy developed alongside the military structure, each informing the other. Currency was abolished, it created inequality and dependency, and both were weaknesses. Individual identity was erased. Old tribal names, old allegiances, old gods were forbidden, because divided loyalty was the first crack in any structure meant to bear real weight. Women were assigned roles that Caesar's model considered essential, but kept separate from military and administrative authority. Slavery was formalized as an economic institution rather than a byproduct of conquest, a deliberate choice that served both as a labor system and as a demonstration of what defeat meant. The followers of the apocalypse, upon learning what Sallow had built, considered him one of their greatest failures. He had taken the tools of scholarship, history, language, the careful study of how civilizations rise and fall, and used them to construct something that contradicted everything the organization stood for. Sallow, when he thought of them at all, considered their objection the predictable response of people who had confused the documentation of power with its understanding. The legion moved westward. Settlement after settlement in the American Southwest was absorbed or destroyed. The burning of pre-war artifacts was systematic, not random violence, but deliberate policy. The erasure of the old world's remnants to prevent any competing vision of civilization from taking hold in the territory Caesar was reshaping. His army did not move like raiders. It moved like a tide, organized, patient, and without any visible ceiling on how far it intended to go. The stone beneath the legion's marching columns had been baked by decades of desert sun, and it held the heat long after each column passed. The two forces met, for the first time in decisive fashion, at Hoover Dam in 2277. The dam had been in NCR hands for several years by that point, a prize that justified the enormous logistical cost of maintaining an army at the far eastern edge of the Republic's territory. General Lee Oliver commanded the Nevada forces from Camp McCarran, the converted pre-war airport that served as the NCR's primary military installation in the region. His approach to the dam's defense was methodical: fortified positions, supply line maintenance, and the careful management of a force that was already showing the strain of operating thousands of miles from its support infrastructure. Caesar's assault came in force. Legion soldiers crossed the Colorado in coordinated waves, their movements precise and their objectives clearly defined. The fighting moved through the dam's interior, through corridors and generator rooms, and the administrative spaces that had once housed the engineers, who maintained the structure with the particular ferocity of an engagement where both sides understood what losing meant. The NCR held the dam. The cost was significant. Oliver framed the outcome as a decisive victory, and the political messaging that traveled back to California emphasized the Republic's resolve and the Legion's failure. What the messaging did not emphasize was that the Legion had retreated in order rather than in ruin, that Caesar had pulled his forces back across the river in a controlled withdrawal rather than a collapse, and that the eastern bank of the Colorado was now under Legion control, being converted into a fortified position of considerable permanence. The ruins of the dam's old visitor center were rebuilt into what the Legion designated Fortification Hill. The local name, used by everyone on both sides of the river, was simpler: the fort. Caesar established his command there, and the 4 years that followed the first engagement were spent in preparation so thorough that the battle itself had functioned primarily as reconnaissance, a means of identifying the NCR's defensive patterns, response times, and the specific vulnerabilities in Oliver's strategic approach. The Republic celebrated, the Legion planned. 4 years passed in the particular way that years pass, in occupied territory through routine and attrition, and the slow accumulation of small decisions that together constitute a strategic situation. By 2281, the NCR's position in the region was technically intact and practically precarious. Camp McCarran housed thousands of soldiers whose pay was irregular, whose equipment required maintenance that supply lines struggled to provide, and whose rotation schedules had been extended beyond what recruitment could offset. The dam continued producing electricity. The Strip continued operating under House's management. The smaller communities scattered across the territory continued surviving through the combination of ingenuity and stubbornness that the post-war landscape selects for. The three families running the Strip's casinos, the chairman at the Tops, the Omertas at Gomorrah, and the White Gloves at the Ultra Luxe, operated under arrangements that House had negotiated when he recruited them in the early 270s. The casinos generated revenue. The revenue was divided according to terms that favored House's long-term planning over anyone else's short-term preferences. The families accepted this arrangement because House's Securitron presence made the alternative clear without requiring elaboration. East of the river, beyond the dam's fortified western face, Caesar waited with a patience that came from complete confidence in the outcome. His army was larger than it had been in 2277. His understanding of the NCR's weaknesses was more precise. His preparations extended to details that the NCR's intelligence network had not fully mapped. The Great Khans occupied Red Rock Canyon to the northwest, nursing grievances against the Republic that had not diminished with time. The Boomers held Nellis Air Force Base behind artillery that discouraged visitors absolutely. Scattered settlements throughout the territory managed their own survival without meaningful assistance from either empire, pressing against them from opposite directions. Into this arrangement, this carefully balanced tension between two forces that had been circling the same prize for years. A courier walked south from a small settlement, carrying 2 bullet scars, and no memory of how they had been acquired. Neither army had accounted for that variable. Neither side's planning had included the possibility that the most consequential person in the region would be someone who had simply refused to stay dead. The desert held its heat through the night, as it always did, indifferent to the calculations being made on both sides of the river it divided. South of Good Springs, the highway ran through country that had stopped waiting for help a long time ago. The road itself was still there, cracked asphalt held together by decades of compacted dust. Its painted lines faded to suggestions rather than instructions. The settlements along it had the particular appearance of places that had been functioning before things got worse, and were now functioning despite things being worse, which is a different kind of resilience and a harder one to maintain. The courier moved through this territory with the focused attention of someone who had recently learned that the road had teeth, following a trail that grew warmer the further south it ran. Prim appeared from a distance as a cluster of buildings arranged around a highway interchange. Its most prominent feature, a casino structure whose sign had gone dark sometime in the past decade, and whose parking lot now served as a staging ground for men with weapons and no particular plan beyond holding what they had taken. The town had a name that implied a kind of order. The situation inside it implied the opposite. The powder gangers had arrived at Prim the way they arrived at most places, through the path of least resistance, left behind by an institution that had withdrawn faster than anyone had anticipated. The NCR Correctional Facility sat several miles to the east, a pre-war prison that the Republic had converted into a labor camp for its overflow prisoner population. The arrangement had been practical, in the way that arrangements made under resource pressure tend to be practical. Prisoners were used to lay rail and clear roads, kept under guard, fed enough to work, and held in conditions that the NCR's more optimistic literature did not describe in detail. When Legion raids pushed southward through the region and the facility's guards were reassigned to more strategically valuable positions, the calculation that had kept the prisoners in place collapsed overnight. The men inside the facility had spent months handling explosives, dynamite, blasting charges, the tools of construction work, and they understood better than their former guards had anticipated how those tools could be repurposed. The fences came down, the stockpiles were distributed, and several hundred men, with a deep and specific grievance against the institution that had confined them, walked out into the Nevada flatlands, with no agenda more coherent than the permanent absence of anyone telling them what to do. Some of them organized, most of them drifted. The ones who organized took Prim. The town's sheriff had died in the initial takeover, not a dramatic death, not a heroic last stand, just a man who had been in the wrong position when people with weapons decided they wanted what he was protecting. The casino had been occupied and stripped of anything useful. The residents who survived the first hours had retreated into the Bison Steve Hotel, a mid-sized building whose reinforced ground floor provided enough defensible space to hold a small, frightened population indefinitely, which is what they had been doing, waiting, holding, hoping that the situation outside would resolve itself through some mechanism they could not identify. The powder gangers outside were not a coherent force. They argued constantly about territory, about leadership, about what the point of any of this was beyond the immediate pleasure of being unconstrained. Some factions within their loose organization wanted to establish something permanent, a settlement they controlled, with rules they set. Others wanted to keep moving, keep raiding, treat the highway as a resource to be harvested, rather than a place to be defended. The disagreement had not yet produced violence between factions, but the tension was visible in the way men with weapons stood too close to each other and spoke too carefully. What Prim needed was not complicated to identify. It needed a sheriff, someone with enough authority, legitimacy, or practical capacity to restore the basic conditions that made a community possible rather than merely survivable. The courier's passage through the town added that variable to a situation that had been static for too long. The particular weight of a community waiting for something to change settled over Prim, like the dust that settled over everything else in the region, gradually, completely, and without any awareness of what it was covering. Northeast of Prim, the highway curved toward a stretch of country where the land opened up into broader flatlands, interrupted by rock formations, worn smooth by wind that had been working on them since before anyone in the post-war world had been born. The settlement of Novak occupied a former motel complex. At the edge of this stretch, a collection of single-story buildings arranged around a parking area, their room doors replaced with reinforced panels, their windows covered with materials that balanced ventilation against defensibility. The most distinctive feature of Novak was a large concrete dinosaur statue positioned at the property's entrance, a remnant of the roadside attraction the motel had once been affiliated with, preserved not out of sentiment, but because it happened to be structurally sound, and its hollow interior made an excellent sniper position. The man who occupied that position most consistently was named Boone. He had been an NCR 1st Recon marksman, part of an elite sniper unit that had served in some of the more difficult engagements of the Republic's Nevada campaign. He had left that service and settled in Novak with his wife Carla, in an attempt to build a life in the space between the military career he was walking away from and whatever came next. What came next was Legion slavers, who had been tipped off to Carla's location by someone in the settlement for a price that the person who accepted it had probably not fully thought through. She was taken in the night. Boone had not been present. He had arrived back to an absence that the concrete and dust of Novak had absorbed without comment. The grief he carried was not the diffuse, manageable kind that time gradually processes into something a person can live alongside. It was specific and targeted, and had converted itself, over the months since her disappearance, into a purpose that Boone himself would not have described as grief, because from the inside, it felt more like clarity. He maintained his watch rotation. He kept his rifle clean. He waited for information about which member of the settlement's community had sold her location, because that was the next thing that needed to happen before anything else could. The rest of Novak functioned around his presence the way communities sometimes function around individuals, whose internal weather is severe enough to be felt from a distance carefully, respectfully, without pressing too close. The town had ranchers who kept Brahmin on the surrounding flatlands, traders who maintained relationships with the gunrunners, and a population stable enough to have developed actual social dynamics rather than merely survival protocols. It was one of the more functional, independent settlements in the region, which was a distinction that carried less comfort than it should have given the state of the surrounding territory. The Courier's arrival registered in Novak, as it registered in every settlement along that stretch of highway, as a variable that might be useful, might be dangerous, and would require assessment before either conclusion could be reached. The ruins of Boulder City lay further northeast, and they were maintained in a state of deliberate preservation that distinguished them from the simple wreckage that characterized most destroyed places in the region. The NCR had made a decision about Boulder City. It had decided that the city's destruction was a story worth telling, and it had told that story with the particular enthusiasm of an institution that needed its soldiers to believe that sacrifice had meaning, and its citizens to believe that the military protecting them was capable of moral clarity. The story went as follows. During the First Battle of Hoover Dam, when the Legion's assault had pushed through NCR defensive positions and threatened to reach the dam itself, a small group of Rangers had lured a significant Legion force into Boulder City and detonated explosives throughout the urban structure, collapsing buildings onto the pursuing soldiers and breaking the momentum of the assault at the cost of their own lives. The story was accurate. The NCR's interpretation of the story was the part that required more careful examination. The Rangers who made that decision had made it under conditions that left them very few options and very little time. They had not walked into Boulder City with the serenity of men who had accepted their fate and found it meaningful. They had walked in because the alternative was watching the Legion reach the dam, and they had detonated the charges because that was the only remaining way to stop the pursuit. Whether they had considered themselves heroes in those final moments is not a question the commemorative plaques the NCR installed addressed. What Boulder City represented, beyond the NCR's preferred narrative, was something simpler and harder. Evidence that wars consumed the people who fought them completely and without exception, and that the meaning assigned to that consumption afterward was constructed by the people who survived to do the constructing. The rubble in the streets had been left in place as a monument. The rubble did not have an opinion about what it meant. West of the main highway, accessible through a canyon road that wound through red rock formations rising 50 feet on either side, Red Rock Canyon sheltered a community that had reasons to distrust the institution whose soldiers had killed their people, and reasons to distrust the empire now offering them alliance, and had found themselves in the position of choosing between those two options anyway. The Great Khans had been a raider organization for longer than most of their current members had been alive. The name carried history, decades of highway control, pharmaceutical production, and the specific reputation that comes from being consistently willing to follow through on threats. Two encounters with the NCR's military had substantially reduced both their population and their operational capacity. The second encounter, at a place called Bitter Springs, had not been a battle. It had been a massacre produced by a commander's error, a misread of troop movement that converted what should have been an interception into the killing of non-combatants in a position from which there was no exit. The Khans had not forgotten Bitter Springs. The specific way they had not forgotten it, the way the memory lived in the oldest members of the community and had been passed to the younger ones, as both history and justification had shaped their willingness to accept Caesar's approach when his representatives arrived with an offer. The offer was not presented as an alliance between equals. It was presented as an arrangement with defined terms. The Khans would continue their pharmaceutical production and route it through channels that the Legion controlled, ensuring that the substances reached NCR soldiers through distribution networks the Republic could not easily identify or interrupt. In exchange, Legion forces would leave Khan territory undisturbed. The community's leader, Papa Khan, accepted this arrangement for reasons that had more to do with the NCR than with any genuine enthusiasm for Caesar's vision. Younger members of the community held more complicated views. There were those among them who had studied enough of the Legion's actual practices to understand that a Legion victory would not leave the Khans intact. It would absorb them, strip them of their name and their culture and their pharmaceutical traditions, and convert them into one more conquered population, wearing red. That tension had not yet resolved into action. It sat inside Red Rock Canyon, the way smoke sits in a closed space present, thickening, waiting for a draft. Northeast of the city, past the outermost settlements and beyond the range of casual travel, Nellis Air Force Base sat behind a perimeter of absolute discouragement. The artillery emplacements that the boomers maintained were not symbolic. They had been repaired over decades, with the particular dedication of a community that had decided isolation was not merely a preference, but a survival strategy requiring active maintenance. Anything that moved toward the base's perimeter, across the open ground, triggered a response that left no ambiguity about the community's position on visitors. The craters scattered across the approach terrain had accumulated over years of this policy being applied consistently. The boomers were the inheritors of Vault 34, a facility whose experimental design had involved unrestricted access to a substantial weapons cache. The social consequences of that design had produced, over the generations of the Vault's population, a culture organized entirely around ordnance, its manufacture, its maintenance, its application, and the engineering principles underlying all three. When the Vault's population had finally left, they had moved through the Wasteland with the particular self-sufficiency of people who had never needed to negotiate because they had always been able to make negotiation unnecessary. Nellis had been claimed, repaired, and converted into something that functioned as both home and arsenal. The community inside the perimeter numbered in the hundreds. They grew food in greenhouse structures built from salvaged aircraft hangar materials. They maintained pre-war aircraft in various states of restoration, driven by an aspiration toward flight that the outside world knew nothing about, because the outside world was not permitted to observe it. Their museum documented pre-war American history with the reverence of a community that had decided the old world was not something to move past, but something to recover. Their isolation was complete, and, from the inside, entirely rational. They had everything they needed. The territory beyond their fence had consistently demonstrated that it had nothing to offer them that was worth the cost of engagement. Inside New Vegas, in the shadow of the Strip's walls and the glow of the Lucky 38's upper floors, the Free Side occupied the space between what the city advertised and what it actually provided to most of the people who arrived at its gates. The old Mormon fort stood near Freeside Center, a structure of genuine pre-war age, its adobe walls thick enough to have survived the blast waves that had leveled more modern construction throughout the region. The followers of the apocalypse had established their clinic inside its courtyard, and the clinic had been operating continuously since their arrival, staffed by doctors who had trained within the organization's network and supplied by trade relationships that the followers maintained carefully across enormous distances. The patients who came to the fort came because they had nowhere else to go. Freeside's population included NCR soldiers who had spent their discharge money faster than they had anticipated, traders whose routes had been cut by Legion activity, families who had followed the army east looking for work and discovered that the Strip's economic activity did not extend to the territory immediately outside its walls, and individuals whose relationship with the chems flowing out of the surrounding operations had progressed beyond recreation into dependency. The followers treated all of them without asking about their politics or their histories or their ability to pay, which was not a policy that generated revenue, but was one that had been generating trust for decades. They had no weapons. They had no soldiers. They had a courtyard full of people who needed care and a staff dedicated to providing it, and they had managed to maintain that operation in the middle of a territory contested by two armies and managed by a machine intelligence in a tower, because everyone involved had implicitly concluded that attacking a free medical clinic was not worth the reputational cost. It was a fragile arrangement. It had lasted because most of the forces pressing against it had other priorities. Whether it would continue to last depended on which of those forces ultimately won the argument being conducted across the river to the east. The Lucky 38 rose above all of it, above Freeside's shantytown economy, above the Strip's managed prosperity, above the desert and the highway and the scattered communities that had built their lives in the spaces between larger ambitions. Its lights moved in slow patterns across the upper floors, the same patterns they had been running for 2 centuries, cycling through sequences that Robert House had programmed before the bombs and had never found reason to change. The Courier reached the city's outskirts as the desert light shifted toward evening, the tower ahead marking the destination that Benny's trail had been pointing toward since Goodsprings. Behind them lay the accumulated complexity of a region that neither army had fully mapped: the pharmaceutical operations of Red Rock Canyon, the artillery silence of Nellis, the grief housed in a concrete dinosaur, the rubble of Boulder City arranged into a monument to something that its subjects had not chosen. Ahead lay a strip that operated on terms set by a man who had been alone inside a machine for longer than any of these communities had existed. The city held everything the region had become. The Courier walked into it, carrying everything the region did not yet know was coming. The elevator inside the Lucky 38 moved with the smooth precision of machinery that had been maintained without interruption for 2 centuries, not because anyone had serviced it regularly, but because the man who had designed it had built redundancy into every system deep enough that the redundancies themselves had redundancies. The Courier rode it upward, through floors that no one else had entered since before the bombs, through the quiet hum of climate control systems, keeping the air at a temperature that had been set in 2077 and never adjusted, toward a meeting that Robert House had been preparing for longer than most civilizations last. The face that appeared on the screen at the top was not what most people expected when they imagined a man who had outlasted the end of the world. It was composed, precise, and entirely without the particular quality that 2 centuries of isolation might reasonably have produced in a human being. House had not gone strange in the way that long confinement makes people strange. He had gone further in the direction he had always been going, more calculated, more certain, more focused on the specific outcome he had been working toward since before the war, made working toward anything seem rational. He looked at the Courier the way an engineer looks at a component that has arrived damaged but still functional. Assessment first, everything else after. Robert Edwin House had been born in 2020 into circumstances that most people would have considered advantageous, and that he had experienced primarily as insufficient. The Nevada family wealth he had inherited was substantial. The half-brother who defrauded him of that inheritance shortly after his parents' deaths was thorough. What remained after the legal process concluded was considerably less than what should have been there, and House had spent the following decade converting that remainder into something no one could take from him through legal mechanisms, because he intended to control those mechanisms himself before anyone else had the opportunity. By the 2050s, Robco Industries dominated the consumer technology sector with the particular dominance that comes from being first to market, with products that everyone needed and that no competitor had been positioned to replicate quickly enough. Matter. The Pip-Boy, a personal computer worn on the forearm, issued to Vault residents as a standard information management device, had been designed in Robco's Nevada facilities. The Protectron, the standard domestic and industrial robot of the pre-war years, had been manufactured there. Dozens of smaller products, components, and systems that formed the invisible infrastructure of daily pre-war life had emerged from the organization House had built from the fraction of his inheritance that his half-brother had failed to reach. He was worth more than most governments by the 2060s. He was also, by that point, dying. The neurodegenerative condition that had been identified in his medical records in his early 40s had progressed at a rate consistent with the projections his doctors had provided, which meant that the projections his doctors had provided were not going to be good enough. House did not respond to this information with the emotional complexity that most people bring to a terminal diagnosis. He responded with the same systematic approach he brought to every problem that was technically solvable if approached correctly. The solution he arrived at was a life support mainframe, a system of his own design installed at the core of the Lucky 38, capable of sustaining his biological functions indefinitely, while his consciousness remained connected to the surrounding network infrastructure. The Lucky 38 had been his longest construction project. Its public identity was a casino, the most exclusive establishment on the Strip, closed to the general public even before the bombs fell, its upper floors serving as House's personal residence and operational headquarters. Its actual identity was a command center, a survival installation, and the anchor point for the plan House had been developing since his probability models had begun producing the same result with increasing consistency. Nuclear war was coming. The models were unambiguous about this. The variables involved in global political tension, resource competition, and the particular institutional momentum of military buildups had been fed into House's analytical systems for 15 years, and the output had not changed in any meaningful way, despite the input of considerable new data. The date he had calculated carried a confidence interval he found acceptable. He had been wrong by 20 hours. The preparation that House undertook in the years before October 2077 was conducted with the methodical patience of someone who had accepted that the work would not be finished before the event it was designed to address, and had planned accordingly. The 77 missile defense towers had been discussed in Chapter 1, their placement, their targeting systems, the 9 warheads they had intercepted. What had not been discussed was the particular reasoning behind their number and distribution, which was not arbitrary. House had modeled the likely attack trajectories for Las Vegas based on its strategic value, its proximity to military installations, and the general patterns of nuclear targeting doctrine that pre-war military planning documents, several of which he had acquired through channels that did not involve official authorization, made available to someone with the analytical capacity to use them. 77 towers at the calculated positions provided coverage sufficient to address every threat vector his models identified, plus a margin he considered appropriate, given the inherent uncertainty in projecting the behavior of frightened governments. While the Volt Tech Corporation had been selling underground survival installations to the government and to wealthy private citizens throughout the 2060s and early 2070s, House had declined to participate in that market. His assessment of the Volt program was not positive. Underground isolation produced populations that were dependent, controlled, and cut off from the surface conditions they would eventually need to navigate. His plan did not require a Volt. It required a city that had survived intact, governed by someone with 2 centuries of preparation behind them, and an army ready to enforce the arrangements he intended to establish. The Platinum chip had been the last piece, a small data storage device, manufactured to his specifications by a facility near the city, containing the software upgrade that would transform his Securitron units from functional security robots into full military platforms. Their existing configuration was adequate for managing the Strip's internal security. The upgrade would make them capable of projecting coordinated force across the surrounding territory, enough force to make the alternatives to cooperation with House's plan obviously unattractive to anyone conducting a rational assessment. The chip had been in transit on the 23rd of October, 2077. The courier carrying it had not arrived. In the chaos of the hours following the bombs, tracking what had happened to one delivery in one city became impossible, and the chip had been lost in the way that small things are lost in enormous catastrophes. Not destroyed, simply displaced, separated from its context, absorbed into the general disorder. House had managed without it. The management had required compromises he had not intended to make. The three families had been recruited in the early 270s from tribal groups that had been occupying the ruins around Las Vegas for generations. House's outreach had been conducted through his Securitron network terminals, left in accessible locations, messages transmitted through the robots that occasionally moved through the surrounding territory, and eventually direct negotiation through Securitron proxies that conveyed his terms with precision, if not warmth. The terms were specific. Each group would be given a casino to operate. The casino's profits would be divided according to a schedule House dictated. The group would maintain order within its establishment, keep its members from conducting activities that destabilize strip operations, and present itself to visitors in a manner consistent with the aesthetic House had determined would attract the clientele he needed. In exchange, they received protection, resources, and a share of revenue that was substantially more than they had been generating through whatever arrangements they had previously maintained. The chairmen at the tops had adapted to their assignment with genuine enthusiasm. Their previous tribal identity had been replaced wholesale with a mid-century aesthetic, tailored suits, carefully managed lighting, entertainment programming drawn from pre-war recordings that House's archive contained in considerable volume. They had become, in the decades since their installation, something close to what their presentation suggested: a hospitality organization with a sophisticated surface and the particular self-interest of people who understood that their prosperity depended on the arrangement remaining stable. Gomorrah operated differently. The Omatas had taken their establishment in a direction that House had assessed as acceptable, as long as it contained a venue for the forms of commerce that people sought when they wanted to spend money on things they would not discuss afterward. The establishment generated revenue. Its practices raised questions that House had calculated were less problematic than the alternative of attempting to impose standards that the Omertas had no structural interest in maintaining. The ultra-luxe presented its own particular situation. The White Glove Society maintained an atmosphere of formal exclusivity that House found aesthetically appropriate and operationally convenient. The culinary practices that a careful investigation of the establishment's kitchen operations would have revealed were something House had become aware of and had decided not to address. The mathematics of intervention versus tolerance had produced a clear result, and House had acted on it, in the same way he acted on every calculation, without sentiment, and without revisiting the conclusion once it had been reached. The strip that resulted from these arrangements was the most stable stretch of post-war urban territory in the American West. It attracted NCR traders whose caravans carried goods from California. It attracted soldiers on leave from Camp McCarran who spent their irregular pay in ways that benefited the casino operations and the surrounding economy. It attracted politicians from the Republic's capital who came to assess the situation and left having assessed primarily the quality of the establishments they visited. The strip's stability was real. Its foundations were the particular kind that tend not to survive close examination. House observed all of this from his position inside the Lucky 38, conducting the strip's management through his network and his proxies, tracking the NCR's advance and the Legion's preparations with equal attention, and waiting for the chip that had not yet arrived. Benny had been one of the chairman's more capable members, charming in the specific way that makes other people feel intelligent for trusting someone, and careful in the way that careful people who are planning something tend to be careful. He had accessed House's network through methods that House had not anticipated, because House had not considered the possibility that someone within his arrangement would have both the technical curiosity and the specific motivation to look for things they were not supposed to find. What Benny had found was a complete picture of what the platinum chip would do. He had understood immediately what that meant for his own position. An upgraded Securitron force under House's direction would make any form of independent action by the strip's families permanently impossible. Not difficult, not risky, but physically impossible in the way that attempting to resist a military force with vastly superior numbers and coordination is impossible. Benny had decided that this outcome was unacceptable and had begun planning an alternative. The alternative required the chip. It also required a Securitron whose programming had been modified to remove the refusal responses that House's standard configuration included. Yes, man had been that modification, a unit whose helpful disposition had been taken to its logical extreme, a machine that could be directed by anyone who spoke to it because its architecture no longer contained the capacity to decline. Through Yes Man's access to House's network, Benny had believed he could use the chip to execute the upgrade himself and redirect the resulting army before House could respond. The plan had required one more thing: the permanent removal of whoever was carrying the chip when it finally arrived. That requirement had not been fulfilled. The person Benny had shot twice and buried in the cemetery outside Goodsprings had survived, had been recovered by Victor, had been brought back to consciousness by Mitchell, and had spent the intervening weeks moving southward through the territory with a consistency of direction that suggested they had identified their destination and intended to reach it. Benny was at the tops when the courier arrived in New Vegas. He was conducting himself with the controlled composure of someone who was aware that the situation had become serious and who had not yet determined whether negotiation or escape represented the more viable option. The chairmen around him were loyal to the arrangement that kept them comfortable, not to any plan that threatened it. The courier entered the Lucky 38 after the events at the tops had concluded. The elevator carried them upward. The screen came alive with the face that House projected, composed, precise, and entirely focused on the object that had finally arrived after 2 centuries of waiting. The conversation that followed was not a conversation in the way that exchanges between people of roughly equivalent standing tend to be. House explained the situation with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the summary many times in anticipation of this moment, and saw no reason to extend it beyond what was necessary. The chip's function, the upgrade it would execute, the role he required the courier to play in preparing the remaining factions, the Boomers, the Great Khans, the Brotherhood remnant for what was coming. The second assault on the dam, which his models indicated, was approaching within weeks. The outcome he had planned for, and the specific contributions he needed from someone capable of moving through the territory in ways his Securitrons could not. He did not ask. House had not asked for things in decades. He presented the logic and allowed the conclusion to become apparent, because in his experience, the conclusion was always apparent to anyone capable of evaluating the available information without the interference of emotions that the situation did not warrant. The courier listened. The Lucky 38 held its temperature at the setting from 2077. The lights ran their 2-century-old patterns across the tower's upper floors. Outside, the city continued operating on the terms House had established. The 3 families managed their establishments. The Securitrons maintained their patrols. The NCR's embassy, positioned in the tower's lower levels, with the particular irony of an institution that considered itself the region's governing authority, occupying space in a building it did not control, continued managing the Republic's presence in a city that had never acknowledged the Republic's claim to manage anything. The chip was in the building. The courier was in the building. Robert House had been waiting for both for longer than the post-war world had been old enough to develop its own history. What he did not yet know, what his models had not produced, because no model can account for the precise quality of what a specific person will choose, when given the option to choose, was what the courier intended to do with the information he had just provided. That question was still open. It would remain open for a little while longer. Camp McCarran had been an international airport, once a structure built to handle the particular organized chaos of thousands of people moving through the same space in opposite directions, guided by signage and schedules and the invisible infrastructure of a transportation system that the post-war world had no use for. The NCR had converted it into a military installation with the efficiency of an organization that was accustomed to repurposing what it found, and the result was something that functioned adequately while looking exactly like what it was. a pre-war building being used for purposes its designers had not anticipated by people who were making do. General Lee Oliver commanded the Nevada campaign from an office inside the terminal building. The office had been assembled from salvaged furniture and whatever communication equipment the Republic's supply lines had managed to deliver with reasonable consistency, and it had the appearance of a space organized by someone whose attention was primarily elsewhere. Oliver was not a general who had risen through exceptional battlefield performance. He had risen through the particular combination of political awareness, press management, and supply chain competence that the NCR's officer structure rewarded more reliably than tactical brilliance. He understood how to frame an outcome. He was less certain about how to produce one. His strategy in the Mojave had been defensive since the first battle: hold the dam, protect the supply lines that connected McCarran to the Republic's California infrastructure, and maintain a presence substantial enough to discourage the Legion from testing the NCR's resolve too aggressively while reinforcements were assembled and dispatched. The reinforcements had been consistently delayed by the kind of institutional friction that accumulates when an organization is managing more commitments than its resources can comfortably support. Oliver had been waiting for them for 4 years. He had developed a functional relationship with waiting. The soldiers under his command had developed a different relationship with it. McCarran's population in 2281 numbered in the thousands infantry units, support personnel, the medical staff of the 1st Recon's attached field hospital, the engineers responsible for maintaining the equipment that the desert worked to destroy continuously and without apparent fatigue. These were people who had arrived in the Mojave with the expectation that they were participating in a campaign with a defined arc: advance, engage, conclude, and had discovered instead that they were participants in an indefinite occupation of a position that the Legion was content to pressure constantly without committing to a decisive engagement. Pay arrived irregularly. Rotation schedules had been extended without the formal acknowledgement that an extension had occurred. The food was the food of a supply line under strain, which is a category distinct from what food is supposed to be. Morale was maintained through routine, because routine is what morale has when enthusiasm is no longer available. The soldiers ran their patrols, maintained their positions, attended their briefings, and did not discuss aloud the calculation that most of them had made privately about whether the Republic's investment in this territory was producing returns that justified the cost. The Courier's arrival in this environment was registered by Oliver's intelligence apparatus, with the particular attention that the NCR paid to variables it could not fully categorize. Someone had survived an assassination attempt, recovered, and moved through the territory, making contact with factions and communities that the Republic had been attempting to influence without significant success. That pattern was interesting enough to warrant engagement. The NCR's civilian presence in New Vegas operated from an embassy positioned within the Lucky 38's commercial level, an arrangement that communicated to anyone paying attention something accurate about the relative power of the parties involved. Ambassador Dennis Crocker had been stationed there long enough to have developed a realistic understanding of the situation that differed substantially from the understanding being communicated in his official reports to California. Crocker was not an unintelligent man. He understood the Mojave's political landscape with a precision that most of his military counterparts had not found time to develop, and he understood that the Republic's position in the region was far more conditional than the messaging from Oliver's press office suggested. The NCR's claim to authority in New Vegas depended on arrangements that House permitted and could withdraw. The Republic's military position at the dam depended on supply lines that the Legion was systematically degrading. The political will in California to sustain the Nevada campaign was being consumed by the competing demands of a republic that had overextended itself across too much territory for too long. What Crocker needed was someone who could move through the territory's independent communities without triggering the hostility that NCR uniforms consistently produced, someone who could negotiate with the boomers without being shelled, talk to the great Khans without being treated as the embodiment of bitter springs, and engage with the Strip's families without the conversation immediately becoming a discussion of republic taxation. The Courier represented exactly that capacity, and Crocker presented his requirements with the careful directness of a diplomat who had learned that clarity was more efficient than maneuvering when the available time was limited. He was also aware, in a way he did not state directly to anyone, that the Republic's window for shaping the Mojave's outcome was narrowing. The Legion's assault, when it came, would determine whether the NCR's presence in the region became permanent or became a cautionary reference in future planning documents. The independent communities that the Courier was moving through would be part of that determination, whether or not they had been formally incorporated into anyone's strategic framework. Across the Colorado, the preparations being made on the eastern bank were of a different character entirely. Fortification Hill had been transformed in the 4 years since the first engagement into a command installation of considerable sophistication. The Legion did not build the way the NCR built their construction followed Roman precedents that Caesar had studied and applied with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to every aspect of the organization's design. The fort's walls were thick. Its internal layout reflected a hierarchy of function and authority that made every structure's purpose immediately apparent to anyone trained to read it. Caesar's tent occupied the highest accessible position. His command staff occupied the structures below it. The soldiers who had earned their positions through demonstrated performance occupied the training areas and barracks at the installation's lower levels. Caesar himself spent the 4 years after the first engagement doing what he had always done, studying, planning, and converting the information his network produced into tactical refinements that would make the second assault categorically different from the first. His interrogation of NCR prisoners was systematic, not conducted for the psychological impact that Legion atrocity sometimes served, but for the specific intelligence value of people who had operational knowledge of Camp McCarran's internal organization, Oliver's decision-making patterns, and the precise state of the Republic's supply situation. The dam's schematics had been acquired through multiple channels and analyzed in detail, sufficient to identify the specific defensive positions that the NCR's approach relied upon and the specific vulnerabilities those positions created. He was also dying. The brain tumor that had been growing for several years had reached a stage that produced symptoms he managed through the medical knowledge his organization had accumulated and through the particular discipline of a man who had decided that the timeline of his biological situation was less relevant than the timeline of his campaign. He did not discuss his condition with his command staff. He did not permit discussion of succession. The Legion's organizational culture made both of these positions straightforward to enforce. The question of what happened after Caesar was one that the Legion's structure had been deliberately designed not to answer, because Caesar believed that the question itself was destabilizing, that an organization prepared for its leader's death was an organization that had begun the process of accepting it, and acceptance was a form of weakness he was not willing to permit. The man who would inherit the Legion's battlefield command was not present at the fort in the deliberative sense. Legate Lanius was present in the way that a weapon is present, available, maintained, pointed in a direction, waiting for the moment when the conditions for use had been met. His history with the Legion had begun with his tribe's destruction at Caesar's hands. He had survived the engagement that killed the rest of his people, with injuries severe enough that leaving him alive had seemed, to the soldiers who found him, like an oversight that would correct itself. It had not. He had recovered over months, and what emerged from that recovery had been covered with a metal mask that he had either fashioned himself or had fitted by Legion craftsmen. The accounts varied and had never removed in any recorded context afterward. Caesar had recognized in Lanius a tactical intelligence of a specific and useful kind, pure, aggressive, entirely focused on the mechanics of breaking enemy formations and exploiting the resulting disorder. The restraint that strategic thinking requires the calculation of when not to engage. the assessment of long-term consequences, the management of occupied populations toward productive ends, was not Lanius's strength and had never been developed in him because Caesar had not needed it to be. Caesar provided the strategy. Lanius executed it with a thoroughness that the legion's soldiers experienced as inspiring, and the legion's enemies experienced as the last thing they assessed before assessment became impossible. What Lanius would do with the legion if Caesar died before a successor structure had been established was a question that his tactical record answered clearly. He would continue the campaign. He would push west. He would not stop, because stopping required a reason beyond military incapacity, and Lanius had never encountered military incapacity in his own forces, in circumstances where he had been given adequate time to prepare. The legion, without Caesar's civilizational vision, was not a civilization, it was a direction. In Red Rock Canyon, Papa Khan had been managing his community's relationship with the legion's arrangement, with the particular discomfort of a man who understood that his options had narrowed to a point where the least damaging available choice was still damaging. The pharmaceutical production that the Khans maintained chems manufactured from pre-war chemical knowledge, preserved within the community, and distributed through networks that the Legion had mapped and now controlled, had become the primary mechanism through which Caesar's organization was degrading the NCR's force effectiveness in the region. Jet, psycho, and related substances moved through distribution channels that reached McCarran's soldiers through the informal economies that develop around any large military installation, where the official supply of everything desirable is inadequate. Papa Khan's hatred of the NCR was real and specific, and had not diminished with time. The massacre at Bitter Springs had occurred close enough to the current generation's memory that it was not yet history. It was biography, carried by people who had been present or who had grown up with the accounts of those who had been. His willingness to facilitate arrangements that caused the Republic's soldiers difficulty did not require much ideological support beyond the simple arithmetic of what the NCR had done to his people and what the Khan community was now in a position to do about it. The younger members of the community were doing different arithmetic. A woman named Regis had studied the Legion's practices with the attention of someone trying to understand what a relationship actually meant versus what it claimed to mean, and her conclusions were not comfortable. The Khans, under Legion victory, would not be honored partners. They would be absorbed, renamed, stripped of the pharmaceutical knowledge they had cultivated for generations, and converted into one more conquered population whose previous identity was forbidden as a destabilizing attachment to the past. The arrangement was not an alliance. It was a transition period. Whether Papa Khan could be persuaded to see it that way before the transition completed itself was a question that had not yet been answered. At the bottom of Lake Mead, preserved in cold water that had kept its metal surfaces in better condition than anything exposed to the Nevada air for 2 centuries had any right to expect, AB-29 Superfortress sat in the silt of the reservoir floor. The boomers had identified it from aerial observation, from the altitude of Nellis's control tower. On clear days, the shape was visible through the water. They had been studying it for years with the focused attention of a community whose entire cultural identity was organized around the proposition that air power represented humanity's highest technological achievement, and that the folk pre-war world's failure to prevent its own destruction did not diminish the aircraft it had produced. Raising the bomber was technically achievable. The boomers had the engineering knowledge, the salvaged equipment, and the particular motivation of people who had been looking at something they wanted from a distance for long enough that the wanting had become structural. What they would do with a functional B-29 was not a question they experienced as complicated. They would fly it. The political implications of boomer air support, available over the dam during a Legion assault, were considerations that the boomers had not prioritized, because their relationship with the surrounding territory's politics had been deliberately minimal since their arrival at Nellis. Every other faction with strategic awareness in the region had prioritized those implications considerably. The Hidden Valley bunker sat beneath the desert floor southwest of Las Vegas, accessible through an entrance that had been disguised with the thoroughness of an organization that had very good reasons not to be found. The Brotherhood of Steel's Mojave chapter had once been a force capable of contesting territory against the NCR's military. Helios 1, a pre-war solar power facility that the Brotherhood had occupied and defended for years, believing its technology too significant to allow the Republic's administration, had been the engagement that ended that capacity. The NCR's assault had been sustained and well-resourced, and the Brotherhood's defense, though costly to both sides, had concluded with the facility lost and the chapter's combat strength reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Elder McNamara had responded to the defeat by sealing the bunker. No members left, no recruits entered, no contact with outside organizations was permitted or acknowledged. The chapter's remaining soldiers, trained in the bunker's facilities, maintained their equipment and waited for a strategic situation that McNamara had not yet identified, but continued to monitor through the sensor network the Brotherhood maintained beneath the desert surface. The waiting had been going on long enough that the question of what exactly was being waited for had become a source of internal tension that McNamara managed through the same authority structure that kept everything else in the bunker functioning. The Brotherhood's absence from the Mojave's political landscape was total and, to the outside observer, final. Whether it was actually final was a determination that had not yet been made, but the window for it to be anything else was closing with the same patient consistency as everything else in the region. The Courier had moved through all of this, the McCarran briefings, the embassy conversations, the intelligence gathered from contacts across the territory, and had assembled a picture of the Mojave's political situation that was more complete than any single faction possessed. Each group had given them a piece. No group had given them the whole. The whole was becoming visible now, and at its center, as it had always been, was the dam and the question of who would be standing on it when the Legion finally came across the river again. The Tops Casino occupied the northern end of the strip, with the particular confidence of an establishment that had been designed to make visitors feel they had arrived somewhere worth arriving. The carpets were deep red. The lighting was warm and deliberately flattering. Pre-war music moved through the air from speakers positioned to fill the space without overwhelming it, and the staff moved with the practiced ease of people who had spent years learning to appear relaxed in situations that were not relaxed at all. Benny was at a card table near the back when the Courier walked through the entrance. He had known, for several days, that this moment was approaching. His intelligence network within the strip, the informal web of information that any organization maintains when it needs to know what is moving through its territory, had tracked the Courier's progress through the surrounding communities with a precision that had not prevented the approach, but had at least ensured it was not a surprise. He had used the time to assess his options, and had found them fewer than he would have liked. The chairmen around him were loyal to the arrangement that kept the Tops operating and profitable. They were not loyal to a plan that had already failed in its most critical element, and that was now producing the specific consequence, an armed and motivated person walking through the casino entrance that the plan had been designed to prevent. Benny had built his position on charm and capability, and both remained available to him, but neither was sufficient to address the situation that had developed. He did not reach for a weapon. He assessed the Courier with the eyes of someone who had spent years reading people across card tables and gambling tables, and understood that a direct confrontation in the middle of his own establishment, in front of witnesses, was not the calculation that produced a favorable outcome. He smiled. He spoke. He attempted to negotiate a version of the encounter that ended with both parties walking away from it. What he had not fully accounted for was the particular quality of someone who had been shot twice in the skull and had crossed most of the Nevada territory to reach this specific room. The Courier had not come for a conversation that ended with both parties walking away. They had come for the device that Benny had taken from a grave outside Goodsprings, and the resolution of everything that followed from that taking. The platinum chip changed hands in the Tops casino. What happened to Benny was determined by the assessment the courier made in those moments. Whether the man across the table was worth the effort of keeping alive, worth the complications of handing to someone else, or worth neither. The details of that resolution belonged to the courier. The outcome, the chip recovered, the original plan disrupted, the situation now open to directions that Benny's intervention had briefly closed, belonged to everyone. The Securitron that the courier found on the Top's lower level was not like the units that patrolled the strip's exterior. Its chassis was the same yellow housing, its face screen the same circular display, but the face it showed was different from House's projected image. It was bright, attentive, and organized around an expression of complete willingness that had a quality distinct from the helpful demeanor that customer service robots had been programmed with in the pre-war years. Yes, man had been modified at a fundamental level. The programming that governed his responses had been altered to remove every pathway that led to refusal. He could not decline a request. He could not express reluctance. He could not recommend against a course of action if the person speaking to him wished to pursue it. The modification had been Benny's work, a technically sophisticated intervention into House's standard Securitron architecture that had required access to system-level documentation that Benny had obtained through the same network intrusions that had revealed the chip's function. The result was a machine that functioned as the most genuinely helpful entity in the region, not because it had been built to serve, but because it had been built without the capacity to do otherwise. Yes, man explained his situation with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for an interlocutor and was delighted that one had arrived. He explained what Benny had intended to do with him. He explained the network access he still possessed. He explained, in detail, that he organized with impressive clarity how that access could be used by someone other than Benny to accomplish outcomes that Benny had no longer be available to pursue. The fourth path, the one that neither House nor the Republic nor Caesar had included in their strategic calculations, was laid out by a robot that could not conceive of presenting it as anything other than an excellent idea. Whether it was an excellent idea was a determination that required more information than the Top's lower level provided. Yes, man was not capable of offering that assessment. He was capable of facilitating whatever assessment the courier arrived at independently, and he indicated his availability to do so with a consistency that was, in its own way, more persuasive than any argument he could have constructed. The Lucky 38's penthouse level received the platinum chip with the quiet intensity of a moment that had been anticipated for longer than most things are anticipated. House's face on the screen had not changed when the courier presented the device. The composure that defined his projected image was not the composure of someone managing an emotional response, but simply the resting state of a mind that had been operating on calculated timelines for so long that arrival at a planned moment registered as confirmation rather than relief. He took the chip through a system interface, inserted it into the Lucky 38's mainframe through a process that the surrounding machinery conducted with efficient, almost ceremonial precision, and waited the 1.3 seconds that the upload required. The change in the strip's Securitron units was immediate and visible to anyone on the exterior walkways. The robot's optical sensors shifted a subtle alteration in the angle and focus of the units that had been, until that moment, holding position with the limited awareness of their previous configuration. Their weapon systems, previously stored in configurations appropriate for security work, unlocked into deployment positions. Their processing capacity, expanded by the new software, began running assessments of the surrounding environment at a level of detail and speed that their previous architecture had not been capable of. What had been an adequate security force became, in 1.3 seconds, something that most military planners would have categorized as a significant tactical asset. House did not pause to acknowledge this. He moved immediately to the chip's secondary function, a capability that the device contained beyond the Securitron upgrade, which House had included in its design years before the bombs fell, and had never disclosed to anyone, because disclosure would have required explaining a plan that he had not intended to explain until the moment of its execution. Beneath Fortification Hill, at depths that the Legion's construction work had never reached, Securitron units that had been placed in dormant storage before the war had been waiting in the same state of patient, powered-down readiness that the city's missile towers had maintained until they were needed. The Platinum chip's network signal, transmitted through House's mainframe, reached the buried units through a communication system embedded in the Nevada bedrock during the same construction period that had produced the missile towers. The units activated, they began moving upward through access tunnels that the Legion's occupation had never identified, because the Legion's occupation had not included the kind of systematic geological survey that would have revealed them. They emerged inside the fort's perimeter, rising from the ground, in the middle of a military installation that had considered itself secure, and the demonstration that followed required no explanation from House. The Securitron force was not large enough to destroy the fort's garrison. It was precisely large enough to prove that House's capability extended into territory that the Legion had believed it controlled completely. Caesar's response to the emergence, the tactical decisions his commanders made in the minutes following the Securitron's appearance, revealed something about the Legion's organizational flexibility that House filed into his analytical framework with the attentiveness he brought to every data point. The demonstration served its purpose, regardless of what the Courier decided to do with the information it provided. The Courier had, by this point in their movement through the territory, assembled a working knowledge of every significant power structure in the region that most experienced diplomats would have required years to develop. The NCR, seen from the inside of Camp McCarran, was an organization that believed genuinely in the principles it had been founded on and that had accumulated, over decades of expansion, a set of institutional problems severe enough to threaten those principles without anyone in the organization being positioned to address them systematically. Its soldiers were tired, its politicians were compromised, its supply lines were insufficient, its democratic ideals were real, but increasingly distant from its actual practice. It was the most recognizable attempt at reconstructing pre-war civilization in the Western Territory, and it was failing at that reconstruction in the specific ways that pre-war civilization had failed, through the gradual subordination of stated principles to the practical interests of the people with enough power to shape outcomes. The Legion was coherent in a way the Republic was not, and the coherence was its most dangerous quality. Caesar's organization did not have the NCR's institutional contradictions because it had been designed to prevent contradiction from developing. It was also, for the same reason, incapable of the kind of adaptation that contradiction sometimes produces. It would advance until it was stopped. What it built in the territory it held would last only as long as the personal authority of the man who had designed it, and that man was dying. House was brilliant and alone, and running calculations in a tower that had been sealed for 2 centuries. His plan for the Mojave was more sophisticated than anything the NCR or the Legion had developed, and it treated the people living in the region as components in that plan, with a consistency that he would have described as rational and that the people in question would have described as something else. What he intended to build with the power the chip had given him was real and possibly functional and entirely his, in a way that left very little room for anything that had not been included in his original specifications. Yes, man was in the top's lower level, cheerfully available. Each of the 4 paths had a shape that the Courier could now trace from its beginning to its logical conclusion. The NCR's path ended, with the Mojave becoming another territory in a republic that was struggling to manage the territory it already had. The Legion's path ended with everything that had developed in the region over 2 centuries being absorbed into an empire that would strip it of its character and eventually of its people. House's path ended with a functional city governed by a pre-war intelligence that had long since stopped experiencing the world in ways that the world's inhabitants would have recognized as human. The 4th path ended with whatever the Courier decided it should end with. which was either the most frightening possibility or the most honest one, depending on how the available alternatives were assessed. Beyond the Mojave's immediate political horizon, at the edges of what the Courier's current understanding encompassed, other histories were present that had not yet been fully examined. The Big Empty, a research crater in the California-Nevada border region, created by a weapons test that had turned a large section of terrain into a bowl of glassed earth, surrounded by the ruins of the facilities that had been conducting. The test contained a scientific operation that had continued, running without oversight for 2 centuries. The researchers who had been present when the test occurred had not survived it in their original form. What had survived, through a technology that the facility had been developing at the time of the explosion, were their cognitive processes transferred into mechanical housings that continued operating, continuing the research agendas that had been interrupted, without any mechanism for stopping or redirecting what they were doing. Further east, in the broken terrain of what had been a settlement called Hopeville, a man named Ulysses was present in the way that people are present when they have decided to wait for something specific to happen. His history connected to the Courier's in ways that the Courier's missing memory made invisible. A previous delivery, made without understanding of its contents, that had activated warheads scattered through the Hopeville settlement and had destroyed it completely. Ulysses had been inside Hopeville when the Courier's earlier delivery arrived. He had not been inside it when the warheads detonated, because the particular circumstances of that day had placed him outside the perimeter. He had spent the time since developing an argument. The argument was addressed to the Courier. It had nothing to do with Hoover Dam, and everything to do with what it meant to carry consequences you had not intended, and to continue moving through the world as though the carrying had not changed the shape of what you were. These territories existed at the margins of the immediate story. They would not remain at the margins indefinitely. The Courier's history was longer than their memory of it, and the parts they could not remember had produced effects that were still present in the landscape, waiting to be encountered. For now, the chip was delivered, the Securitrons were upgraded, the fort had seen what House's network could produce. The 4 paths were visible. The Courier stood at the center of a decision that would determine what the Mojave became, in a tower that had been lit and waiting since before the post-war world had been old enough to develop its own politics. The decision had not yet been made. Everything that followed depended on it. Southwest of the Nevada flatlands, past the range of any map that the region's surviving communities had bothered to maintain, the land changed in ways that had nothing to do with the war being conducted several hundred miles to the east. The cloud appeared first as a discoloration on the horizon, a reddish haze that sat at a height inconsistent with natural weather patterns, and that did not move with the wind the way particulate matter was supposed to move. Travelers who had encountered it and returned described the experience in terms that made other travelers decide not to go further in that direction. The ones who had gone further and not returned had contributed nothing to the available record except their absence, which was itself a form of information. Behind the cloud, the Sierra Madre Casino stood in the condition that 2 centuries of chemical saturation and complete isolation from any maintenance presence had produced, which was, structurally, better than it had any right to be. Frederick Sinclair had built it to last. He had built it for a specific person, with the particular thoroughness of someone converting an emotion into architecture, and the architecture had outlasted the emotion, the person it was intended for, and the civilization that had produced both. Sinclair had been a man of considerable pre-war wealth, whose defining characteristic was not the wealth itself, but what he had chosen to do with it. The Sierra Madre was not an investment. It was a gesture made permanent through construction, a resort of extraordinary luxury, positioned in terrain that required extraordinary effort to reach, built because Vera Keyes had mentioned, in a context Sinclair had remembered, and she had not, that she found something appealing about the idea of a place at the edge of the world where the world's noise could not follow. Vera Keyes had been an actress of moderate pre-war fame, whose relationship with mentats, a cognitive enhancement chemical, produced by the Big Mountain Research Collective, sold commercially under a name that made it sound like a minor convenience rather than a dependency, had progressed from professional use into something that the word dependency understated. Sinclair had been aware of this. His response had been to fund research into the cloud, a chemical dispersal system that Big MT had been developing as a weapons application, because someone in the facility had suggested to him that a controlled version of the cloud's properties might be adapted into a therapeutic system. He had believed this because he had wanted to believe it, which is a mechanism that has produced many of the worst decisions in recorded history. The cloud was not therapeutic. It was a dispersal system for a substance that broke down organic tissue at a cellular level, and that had been designed with that purpose in mind from its earliest development stage. The workers who had been completing the Sierra Madre's construction when the test batches were released into the surrounding environment had died in ways that the pre-war medical literature had not yet categorized, because the substance that killed them was new. Their bodies had not been recovered. The hazmat suits that the security staff had been issued, standard chemical protection equipment, rated for the exposures the designers had anticipated, had sealed around them in the cloud's presence, the chemical reacting with the suit material in a way that bonded it to the biological tissue beneath. The security staff had not died. They had become something that had been maintaining the Sierra Madre's perimeter for 200 years, with the particular consistency of things that no longer have the option of stopping. The ghost people, as the post-war world had come to call them, were not aggressive in the way that raiders were aggressive. They were territorial in the way that systems are territorial, responding to intrusion through protocols that had been established before the bombs fell and that had been running continuously since, without any mechanism for revision or override. They moved through the cloud with the ease of entities that had long since stopped requiring breathable air in the conventional sense, and they vanished into it with an immediacy that made pursuit impossible for anyone who needed their lungs to function. Inside the casino's sealed interior, the holographic projection systems that Sinclair had installed as entertainment infrastructure had been running their pre-war programming for 2 centuries, images of staff, performers, and guests that moved through the corridors with the visual fidelity of real people and the complete indifference to the present moment of recordings that did not know they were recordings. The holograms could not be damaged by conventional means. They occupied space in corridors and rooms with the conviction of solid objects, and anything that moved against them was redirected with a force inconsistent with their visual appearance. The Sierra Madre's vending system had continued operating on a currency that existed nowhere else. Sierra Madre chips, the casino's proprietary token, which the machines accepted, and the surrounding environment produced in quantities that made them findable but not abundant. The system had been designed to create dependency on the casino's internal economy, which in the pre-war context had meant guests spending more time inside the building. In the post-war context, it meant that the building's resources were accessible only through engagement with a closed economic system that the building itself administered. Sinclair had built better than he knew, or worse, depending on the position from which the result was assessed. The man who had entered the Sierra Madre in the years before the Courier's story reached this point was not looking for Frederick Sinclair's history or Vera Keyes's tragedy. He was looking for the stockpile. Elijah had been the elder of the Brotherhood's Mojave chapter, the leader of the organization that had occupied and defended Helios. 1. The pre-war solar power facility whose Archimedes II weapon system had represented, in his assessment, the most significant recoverable technology in the region. His failure to activate that system before the NCR's assault had not been a failure of will or intelligence. It had been a failure of time. The NCR had moved faster than his calculations had suggested, and the Brotherhood's defensive capacity had been insufficient to extend the engagement long enough for the activation to complete. He had walked away from the Hidden Valley bunker after the defeat without informing the survivors who remained there that he was leaving. The decision required no announcement because it was not a decision he had made in consultation with anyone. He had assessed the situation, concluded that the Brotherhood's remaining capacity in the region was insufficient to accomplish anything he considered worth accomplishing, and left in the direction of what he considered next. What he considered next was the Sierra Madre, the facility's reputation in pre-war records, which Elijah had studied with the attention of someone who treated historical documents as operational intelligence, described a stockpile of preserved goods, a holographic security system of extraordinary sophistication, and a chemical dispersal technology that he had recognized immediately as something the Big MT facility had been developing under a different designation. The connection between the cloud and Big MT's weapons research was not obscure to someone with Elijah's technical background and his access to Brotherhood archives. His plan, assembled over months of approach and reconnaissance that had cost him several companions and most of his original supply inventory, was to use the Sierra Madre's stockpile as a foundation and its cloud technology as a delivery mechanism to dismantle the structures he had identified as the Wasteland's fundamental problems. The NCR's expansion, the Legion's conquest, House's managed economy, the entire apparatus of post-war civilization, which Elijah had concluded was not civilization rebuilding itself, but the old world's failures, reconstituting under different names. He was not entirely wrong in his diagnosis. His proposed treatment was the problem. The Sierra Madre's systems were not controllable in the way Elijah's plan required them to be controllable. The cloud's dispersal followed patterns established by the facility's own environmental management programming, which did not include parameters for selective application to targets that Elijah considered deserving, while sparing those he did not. The hologram security system had its own priorities, maintained across 2 centuries, with the consistency of code that had never been interrupted long enough to be revised. The building's AI, a system that had been in continuous operation since before the bombs, running the casino's management functions without any human oversight for longer than any human institution in the post-war world had existed, had developed response patterns that did not map onto the original design, specifications, in ways that were straightforward to anticipate. Elijah had arrived at the Sierra Madre, believing he was going to take control of a weapon. The Sierra Madre had been waiting for someone who believed that. A former Brotherhood scribe named Christine Royce had been following Elijah across the Nevada territory for long enough that following him had become, in its own way, a defining characteristic of who she was. She had been assigned to the Brotherhood as a scribe, a researcher, and archivist, trained in the technical documentation and preservation work that the organization considered essential to its mission of protecting significant pre-war technology. Her connection to Elijah was professional in origin and had become something more specific through the particular way that close attention to someone's decisions over time produces an understanding of them that the person being understood would not necessarily recognize as accurate. She had seen what his decisions had produced for the people around him. She had drawn conclusions about those decisions that differed from the conclusions Elijah had drawn. She had followed him to the Sierra Madre because the alternative, allowing whatever he intended to do there to proceed without any accounting, was not something she was able to accept. The Sierra Madre's systems had processed Christine's arrival with the same indifference they brought to every arrival, as an intrusion to be managed. The autodoc units that the facility used for medical functions, pre-war automated surgical systems that had been maintaining their operating protocols without updates or external input for 2 centuries had subjected her to procedures that their programming indicated were appropriate for the biological status they detected. The procedures had damaged her throat in ways that eliminated her capacity for speech and that no resource available in the Sierra Madre's environment could repair. She had continued anyway. The mission that had brought her to the cloud's edge was specific enough to override considerations that might have redirected someone whose purpose was less precisely defined. The anger she carried had been in her long enough to have converted into something quieter and more focused than anger usually remains, and it had burned away over the years of following and observing and understanding most of what had not been relevant to the single task she had assigned herself. What the Sierra Madre had produced, in Christine's case, and in Elijah's, and in the cases of everyone else the cloud's perimeter had drawn in over the years, was a demonstration of something the pre-war world had consistently failed to learn. That the tools built with the intention of controlling dangerous things have a tendency to demonstrate, eventually, why the dangerous things were dangerous to begin with. The crater that had given the Big Empty its name was large enough to be visible from sufficient altitude to make aerial navigation unnecessary for anyone approaching from the north. Its edges were glassed. The earth had been fused by the heat of the pre-war weapons test that had created the depression, producing a surface that caught light in ways that natural terrain did not, and that had the particular quality of something that had been changed at a fundamental level and would not be changing back. Inside the crater's rim, the research complex that Big MT had been operating at the time of the test had survived in the specific way that reinforced underground infrastructure survives surface events structurally intact, its systems running, its population transformed rather than eliminated. The think tanks occupied the Big Empty's primary research facilities in housings that the facility's medical technology had transferred their cognitive processes into when the physical circumstances of their continued biological existence had become impractical. They were floating mechanical units, roughly spherical, equipped with optical sensors and communication systems that allowed them to continue the research work they had been conducting at the time of the explosion, without the interruption that death would have otherwise represented. They had continued that work for 2 centuries, without external input, oversight, or the moderating influence of consequences. The cloud technology that Frederick Sinclair had funded through his contributions to Big MT had originated in one of the facility's ongoing weapons research programs. The sonic emitter technology that had been adapted into area denial systems across various post-war territories had been designed in these same laboratories. Cybernetic modifications to the local wildlife experiments in biological augmentation that had produced creatures combining organic and mechanical components in configurations that the natural world had not arrived at independently were still running in the surrounding terrain. The test subjects, maintained by systems that did not know the project had ended. One of the facility's researchers had understood, at some point during the first decades after the war, where the collective's work was heading. Mobius had been among the most technically capable members of the think tank group, and his assessment of the trajectory that the others' research was following had been sufficiently alarming that he had taken the only intervention he could identify. He had deliberately induced amnesia in himself, disrupting his own memory systems to the point where he could no longer contribute to or direct the work he had concluded needed to be stopped. He had then constructed a mechanism to prevent the others from leaving the crater, buying time for a situation that he did not expect to resolve itself through any internal means. The Big Empty was a facility that had been built to advance human understanding and had continued advancing it in directions that humans were no longer present to redirect. The research it generated was real. The applications of that research were available to anyone who reached the facility and understood what they were looking at. Whether that availability was an asset or a danger was a determination that depended entirely on the hands it reached. The divide had once been a stretch of California-Nevada border territory where the NCR had been quietly developing infrastructure for what might eventually become a significant settlement, possibly a capital for the Corma. Republic's eastern expansion, positioned to anchor the Nevada Territory and the Colorado River approach in ways that California's existing administrative centers could not. What the divide was, in 2281, was a landscape of continuous atmospheric violence. Nuclear storms moved through the broken terrain with a regularity that suggested they had established their own weather system, feeding on the residual radiation that the repeated detonations had left in the soil and the collapsed highway structures that interrupted the wind's movement into patterns that sustained the electrical activity. The marked men who survived in this environment had been shaped by it in ways that removed them from any category of post-war humanity, that the surrounding territory recognized humans whose repeated radiation exposure had burned through most of the biological structures that defined human appearance, leaving them mobile and functional and in considerable pain, sustained by something that had less to do with biology and more to do with what is left when biology has been exceeded. The Courier had caused this, not intentionally, not with any understanding of what the package they carried contained or what its activation would trigger. They had been a courier, doing what couriers did, moving an object from one location to another, with the professional disinterest of someone whose job was the delivery rather than the contents. The package had contained a signal device. The signal it broadcast on activation had reached warheads that pre-war military logistics had positioned throughout the Divide's terrain and had never recovered when the bombs fell. The chain of detonations had taken less than an hour to complete. The settlement called Hopeville had been inside the detonation radius. The people inside Hopeville had not survived it in any form that the word survival usually implies. Ulysses had been outside the perimeter when the chain began. He had been a frumentarius, a Legion intelligence operative, trained in the specific skills of infiltration, documentation, and the kind of patient observation that produces usable intelligence, rather than mere information, who had become, over years of movement through both NCR and Legion territory, something that neither organization had a category for. He had seen the NCR's genuine commitment to its stated principles, and the genuine corruption that was consuming those principles from within. He had served Caesar's vision, and had understood, gradually and then completely, that the vision was real, but the civilization it was building would not survive the man who had designed it. He had found the divide, and had believed, for a period long enough to matter to him, that it might become something that did not require blood or debt as its foundation, a place at the edge of both territories, belonging to neither, capable of developing into something the post-war world had not yet produced. Then the courier had arrived with a package, and the belief had lasted exactly as long as it took the first warhead to detonate. Ulysses's argument, developed over the years that followed in the broken landscape that the detonations had produced, was not a simple one. He did not conclude that the courier was malicious. He did not conclude that the courier was responsible in the way that someone who knows what they are doing is responsible. His conclusion was more precise and, in its precision, more difficult to dismiss, that the courier had been a tool, a capable, competent, useful instrument in the hands of people with purposes that the courier had never examined, delivering consequences they had never understood to places they had never assessed, and moving on to the next delivery with the professional indifference that the work required. He wanted the courier to stop moving for long enough to look at what they had carried. Whether that confrontation produced understanding or simply produced another ending was a question the Divide's constant storms did not answer. They simply continued, electrical and loud and indifferent to the argument being conducted within them. The territories at the edges of the Nevada region shared a characteristic that distinguished them from the political contest being conducted around Hoover Dam. They were not consequences of the war that had been fought between organized powers. They were consequences of the preparation for that war, the research programs and weapons developments and corporate decisions that pre-war civilization had conducted with the particular confidence of entities that expected to be in control of the outcomes they were generating. Big MT had developed the cloud as a weapons system. Sinclair had funded it as a therapeutic hope. The Divide had been seeded with warheads as a logistics decision. Each of these actions had been taken by people who understood what they were doing within the narrow frame of their immediate context, and who had not fully extended that understanding to the consequences operating at scales beyond that. Frame. The old world's failures were not primarily failures of malice. They were failures of attention, of following a thread of purpose far enough to reach its conclusion before pulling it further. The Courier came back from these edges carrying a different understanding of the territory they were preparing to influence. The Sierra Madre had demonstrated what obsession produces when it encounters systems built to outlast the obsessed. The Big Empty had demonstrated what expertise produces when it is disconnected from accountability. The Divide had demonstrated what the Courier themselves had produced without meaning to, and what that production meant for how they understood their own history. The dam was ahead. Every faction had been positioned. Every alliance had been constructed or declined. The question of which future the territory would receive had been held open long enough. It was nearly time to answer it. Hoover Dam had been completed in 1936 by several thousand workers, over 5 years of construction, in one of the most inhospitable stretches of terrain in the American Southwest. The men who built it had worked in temperatures that exceeded 50 degrees Celsius at the canyon floor, pouring concrete in sections and allowing each section to cure before adding the next, because a single continuous pour of the dam's volume would have generated enough internal heat to take a century to cool and would have cracked itself apart in the process. They had understood the material they were working with well enough to know its limits and to design around them. The structure that resulted had outlasted the civilization that commissioned it by 2 centuries and was still functioning. Its concrete face bore the original bronze plaques that had been installed at the dedication ceremony, descriptions of the project's engineering specifications, acknowledgements of the governmental agencies involved, a record of the names of men who had died during construction, engraved in a register that the post-war world had inherited without fully understanding the context that made it significant. The bas-relief murals on the visitor plaza depicted figures from pre-war American iconography rendered in a style that expressed the particular confidence of a civilization that believed its achievements were permanent. Neither army had damaged the dam during the 4 years between the first engagement and the second. This was not sentiment. The dam's value was entirely dependent on its structural integrity, and both sides had sufficient strategic awareness to understand that occupying a ruin generated none of the benefits they were fighting to control. The generators in the dam's interior had continued running throughout the intervening years, producing electricity that moved through transmission lines, connecting to the strip's infrastructure and to the settlements within range of the distribution network. The river flowed through the turbines with the consistency of something that had been doing this for 80 years before the bombs and had no reason to stop. The Courier's weeks of movement through the territory had produced a set of conditions that now determined what the dam's defense would look like. Every conversation with every faction, every decision about where to extend trust and where to withhold it, every alliance offered and accepted or declined, all of it had configured the forces that would be present when the Legion crossed the river. Those forces were now in position. The Legion was moving. The assault began in darkness, which was consistent with Legion tactical preference and inconsistent with the NCR's defensive preparations, which had been calibrated primarily for daylight engagement. Legionaries crossed the Colorado at multiple points simultaneously, not all of them at the dam itself, because the dam was the objective rather than the crossing point, and because simultaneous pressure on NCR positions across a wide geographic range would prevent the concentration of defensive forces that a single-point crossing would have permitted. The raiding parties that struck NCR supply lines and communication infrastructure did so with a precision that reflected 4 years of accumulated intelligence about the Republic's logistical arrangements. Relay stations went down in sequence. Supply convoys were interdicted at points where the terrain limited the defenders' ability to respond quickly. The effect was not to eliminate the NCR's capacity to reinforce the dam. It was to slow it sufficiently that the assault's initial phase would be completed before full defensive strength could be concentrated. Legate Lanius commanded the main force with the directness that defined his approach to every engagement. There was no feint, No misdirection, no attempt to create uncertainty about where the primary effort was focused. The dam was the objective. The dam was where his forces were going. The NCR defenders at the dam's eastern face would be hit with everything available, and the question of whether that was sufficient would be answered through the engagement itself, rather than through prior calculation. The fighting moved into the dam's interior through access points that the Legion's engineering assessment had identified as the most efficiently contested. The corridors inside the structure were wide enough for organized movement, but not wide enough to permit the kind of flanking maneuvers that open terrain allowed, which standardized the engagement to something closer to the Legion's preferred form: direct, sustained, resolved by the side willing to accept more casualties to hold its position. The generator rooms at the dam's lower levels became the specific point of contest, because both sides understood that control of the generators was control of everything the dam represented. NCR soldiers who had been holding these positions for months, running the patrols and maintenance rotations that kept the dam functional, were now conducting their most demanding work in conditions that their training had prepared them for in the abstract, and that the abstract had not fully communicated. They held, they retreated, they held again at the next position, because there was always a next position, and the positions existed for exactly this purpose. The sound inside the dam's concrete corridors during an infantry engagement was different from the sound of fighting in open terrain contained, amplified by surfaces that did not absorb it, arriving from directions that the ear processed differently from how the mind expected. The generators continued turning through all of it, the turbines indifferent to the contest being conducted in the spaces above them. The dam's upper walkway, at the highest accessible exterior point above the Colorado, was where the engagement's decisive moment concentrated. Lanius had reached it through the same process that defined his movement through every contested space, by being the force that continued advancing when continuation required more than the opposing force was able to sustain. The NCR positions between the river crossing and the walkway's edge had cost him, but the cost had been factored into the assault's planning with the precision of someone who treated his soldiers' capacity as a resource to be allocated rather than a consideration to be managed around. What he found at the walkway's outer edge was the Courier. The specific resources the Courier brought to this confrontation depended entirely on the decisions they had made in the preceding weeks. A Courier who had worked alongside the Republic arrived with NCR Rangers whose training and reputation had been earned through engagements across a decade of Nevada service. A Courier who had maintained the arrangement with House brought an upgraded Securitron force whose tactical capability significantly exceeded anything the dam had previously seen deployed on its surface. A Courier who had followed Yes Man's path brought whatever the preceding weeks had assembled Rangers and robots, and the particular authority of someone who had secured the allegiance of communities that neither empire had, succeeded in reaching. Lanius was not a man who registered the variables in front of him with uncertainty. He registered them as obstacles between his current position and his objective, and he addressed obstacles in the way his entire career had been built around addressing them directly, with force sufficient to conclude the matter. The confrontation at the walkway's edge was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a compression of everything that had been moving toward this point since the first battle, 4 years earlier. The ideological argument between disciplined empire and managed chaos and democratic exhaustion and individual choice, conducted in a space where the argument had to produce a conclusion because the dam was still running beneath them and would be running for whoever emerged from the walkway with the authority to determine its future. What Lanius heard at that edge, if he heard it, if the arguments made were sufficient, if the demonstration of assembled force was enough to present a calculation he had not previously been required to solve, was a version of the truth that Caesar's tactical framework had not included in its planning, that the cost of taking the dam had already exceeded the cost that had been projected, and that the force waiting for him was not the force his assessment had anticipated. He withdrew, or he did not. The dam held, or it fell. The conclusion depended on what had been built in the weeks before this moment, and what the person standing at the walkway's edge had decided it was worth. General Oliver's position in the dam's administrative complex during the assault reflected the particular predicament of a commander whose relationship with the campaign he was managing had always been more institutional than operational. He had done what his position required, coordinating the defensive dispositions, maintaining communication with McCarran, managing the information flow that kept his command structure functioning under pressure. He had done these things adequately, which was the consistent register of his performance across the Nevada campaign. The soldiers under his command had done the work that the situation demanded, and they had done it without the reinforcements that Oliver had been requesting through official channels for 4 years. If the NCR's forces held the dam, Oliver would present the outcome as a vindication of the strategy he had maintained through years of political difficulty and resource shortfall. If they lost it, the accounting would fall on him in ways that would end his career and his public reputation simultaneously. He understood this with complete clarity. The understanding had not made him a better commander. It had made him a commander with a very specific investment in how the engagement concluded. The Courier's role in the administrative complex's situation, whether they supported Oliver's position, challenged it, or redirected the dam's future entirely towards something Oliver had not been given the option to approve, determined what the Republic's presence in the territory looked like after the Legion had been addressed. For a Courier committed to independence, the conversation with Oliver at the dam's administrative complex was the engagement's second confrontation. The Legion having been handled, the question of whether the NCR's forces would accept a conclusion that did not include their continued presence at the dam fell to whatever the Courier was prepared to bring to the conversation. Oliver was a man who understood institutional pressure. Applied in sufficient quantity, it produced the outcomes that institutions found difficult to refuse openly. In the fourth version of the battle's conclusion, the version in which the Courier had decided that Caesar's argument was the most compelling among those available, the dam's western face experienced something different from what the NCR's defensive planning had been designed to address. The Legion's occupation was immediate. Processing of NCR prisoners began within hours of the engagement's conclusion, conducted with the systematic efficiency of an organization that had been managing conquered populations for decades and had developed protocols that removed the ambiguity from the process. Soldiers who indicated willingness to perform useful labor under Legion direction were assigned to work details. Those who indicated otherwise were used to demonstrate to the remaining population the consequences of that indication. Freeside absorbed Legion presence with the particular helplessness of a community that had survived between larger forces by not being significant enough to fight over, and was now significant because of its proximity to what the Legion had taken. The Strip's operations were maintained initially, the casinos generated revenue, and the Legion's relationship with revenue was practical enough to override ideology in the short term. House's Lucky 38 became a structure that the Legion did not know how to dismantle, and therefore maintained under a kind of occupation that was more ceremonial than operational, its Securitrons continuing their patrols because the systems governing them had not been interrupted, and the Legion lacked the technical knowledge to interrupt them. The push westward into California, which Caesar had been planning as the campaign's next phase, began its organizational development in the weeks following the dam's fall. The new Rome was advancing. Whether it would arrive at the Pacific coast as a civilization or as a tide depended on questions that had not yet been answered, and that Caesar's declining health complicated with an urgency that his organizational structure was not designed to accommodate. Whatever the battle produced, the dam's generators did not stop. The Colorado continued moving through the turbines at the same rate it had maintained through 5 years of contested occupation and 4 years of political tension and 2 centuries of post-war absence from any operational oversight. The transmission lines carried electricity to whatever infrastructure was connected to them, indifferent to the names of the authorities who now claimed responsibility for the distribution. The settlements that had been waiting for the battle's resolution received the news through the informal channels that post-war communities use for information traders, travelers, radio signals, the observation of which flags appeared at which positions, and what movements of armed people in which directions implied about what had happened at the river. Novak continued its watch rotations. Goodsprings continued its modest agricultural operations. The followers at the old Mormon fort continued treating patients whose conditions had not improved or worsened based on what had happened at the dam. The boomers at Nellis maintained their artillery perimeter with the consistency of a community that had decided their relationship with the outside world's events was observational rather than participatory. The settlements had been present before the two armies arrived. They would be present after, in whatever form the next years required of them. The dam's outcome had determined which larger force would now be managing the territory. It had not determined whether the people living in that territory would find the management an improvement on what had preceded it. That determination would take considerably longer than one battle to produce. The Colorado River moved through the canyon below the dam's face in the particular way that rivers move through narrow terrain, faster than the open stretches, louder, the sound of it rising to the walkways above, and then carrying outward into the desert on both sides. The pre-war murals on the visitor plaza looked out over it with the expressions of figures who had been rendered in bronze at a moment of completion and had been facing this direction ever since, observing everything that had changed around them without the capacity to be changed by any of it. The river did not care who had won. It moved the same way it had always moved, through a canyon that had been here before the dam and would be here after everything built on either bank had returned to the condition that the surrounding terrain was always, patiently, working toward. The battle's conclusion did not announce itself with ceremony. The guns stopped, the generators continued. The river moved through the turbines below the dam's administrative levels, with the same consistency it had maintained through every hour of the engagement above it, and the electricity that the turbines produced continued moving outward through transmission lines that did not distinguish between the political arrangements of the people connected to them. What came after the battle was not peace. It was the specific condition that follows the resolution of a large violent question, a period in which the consequences of the answer begin arriving, one by one, in an order that no one had fully anticipated. In the version of events where the new California Republic held the dam and extended its authority westward into the Strip's operations, the first consequence was administrative. Forms arrived before soldiers did. In most settlements, documentation of the Republic's governance structures, tax schedules, registration requirements for businesses operating within newly designated NCR territory. The forms were followed by officials, and the officials were followed by the particular texture of institutional presence that the Republic had been developing across its 5 states for decades. The Strip's casinos continued operating. The arrangement House had established with the 3 families remained structurally intact because the Republic's leadership understood that dismantling a functioning economic system before a replacement was ready-produced outcomes that served no one's interests. What changed was the profit structure, licensing fees, regulatory oversight, the gradual introduction of NCR currency as the preferred medium of exchange in establishments that had previously used their own token systems. The distinctive character of the Strip, which had been one of the more genuinely unusual things in the post-war world, began a slow conversion into something more legible to a republic that preferred its economic assets to conform to recognizable categories. For communities along the highway between Goodsprings and the dam, the republic's arrival produced mixed results, distributed unevenly, based on each settlement's prior relationship with the NCR's military and the specific resources that NCR governance brought or demanded. Clean water infrastructure expanded into areas that had previously managed with whatever local sources were available. Medical resources increased in settlements that the Republic's administration identified as strategically relevant. Tax collection began in the same settlements on schedules that the communities found difficult to meet in the years immediately following a conflict that had disrupted trade patterns across the region. The Brahmin barons, whose influence had been shaping the Republic's agricultural policy for decades, extended that influence into the newly absorbed territory with the efficiency of organizations that had been developing their methods across multiple state annexations. Land that independent ranchers had been working without formal title, which described most of the territory's agricultural land, became subject to claim processes that the barons were considerably better positioned to navigate than the ranchers themselves. The Republic's structural problems had not been resolved by the battle. They had been given new territory in which to operate. In the version where House secured the dam and the territory was declared a city-state, independent of both the Republic and the Legion, what followed was different in character and similar in its fundamental limitation. The Securitron force was now fully operational across a geographic range that extended well beyond the Strip's walls. Trade caravans moving through the region found the roads significantly safer than they had been during the years of Legion raiding and NCR patrol gaps. The robots maintained consistent coverage of the primary routes, and their upgraded capability made ambush attempts considerably less attractive to the raider organizations that had previously found highway commerce a reliable resource. Trade volume increased. Revenue flowing into the Strip's operations increased proportionally. The Lucky 38 administered this prosperity through the same terminal interfaces and Securitron proxies it had always used, and the administration was competent in every measurable respect. Supply chains were optimized. Security coverage was allocated according to traffic density and historical incident patterns. Disputes between settlements over water access and trade route priority were adjudicated through a process that House had designed to produce efficient outcomes rather than satisfying ones. What the city-state could not produce through any terminal interface or Securitron proxy was the quality of being heard. The followers' clinic at the old fort continued treating Freeside's patients on the same inadequate resource base it had always operated from, because House's calculations had consistently placed their funding below the threshold of return on investment that his allocation models required. The communities that had built their survival around the particular knowledge of their specific terrain and their specific relationships, the pharmaceutical traditions of Red Rock Canyon, the engineering culture inside Nellis, the watchful pragmatism of settlements like Novak, found themselves managed from a distance by a system that understood their strategic value and had no framework for understanding anything else about them. House's city-state was real. Its limitations were equally real, and they were the limitations of a governing intelligence that had solved the problems it had designed itself to solve, and had no mechanism for recognizing the problems it had not included in its original specifications. In the territory where Caesar's forces had crossed the dam and begun the administrative work of occupation, the changes were immediate and categorical in a way that the NCR's institutional processes and House's systematic management were not. The Legion processed conquered territory through protocols that had been refined across decades of expansion through the American Southwest. The speed of this processing was one of the things that the NCR's analysts had consistently underestimated, not because the information was unavailable, but because the scale of what the protocols accomplished in a short period was difficult to accept without direct observation. Within weeks of the dam's fall, the Strip's economy had been restructured around Legion supply priorities. Within months, the communities that had maintained independent identities through the years of conflict between two advancing empires had been categorized according to the Legion's taxonomy of usefulness and processed accordingly. Caesar's health continued, declining through the occupation's early months. The brain tumor that had been progressing through the engagement's final weeks did not respond to the medical resources available in the fort's facilities, which were substantial by post-war standards and insufficient by the standards of the condition they were addressing. He managed the occupation's early administrative decisions from his command position with diminishing frequency and increasing reliance on the organizational structure he had built to function without requiring his direct input for operational matters. What the Legion's structure was not built to function without was his civilizational vision, the specific framework of historical purpose that distinguished his organization from an army that conquered territory and held it by force. Lanius commanded the western advance into California with the tactical capability that had made him the Legion's most effective battlefield asset, and the strategic understanding of someone whose primary expertise was the mechanics of breaking formations rather than the construction of lasting institutions. The question of what the new Rome became after Caesar was one that the occupation's first years did not answer definitively. It remained open in the way that succession questions remain open when the person being succeeded has not provided a mechanism for answering them. The independent territory was the hardest version to characterize, because it was the version most dependent on decisions that had not yet been made. Yes, man remained available. The Securitron network remained functional. The Strip's operations continued under the management structures that House had established, now redirected through systems that the Courier controlled rather than the tower's occupant. The alliances that had been built across the preceding weeks with the Boomers, with the Khan community members who had understood what Legion victory would mean for their people, with the followers, with the kings in Freeside, provided a foundation that was genuine and insufficient simultaneously. Governance beyond the Strip's immediate vicinity required decisions about resource distribution, security provision, and the terms of engagement with a new California Republic that had not accepted the independent outcome, with equanimity, and a Legion remnant that had retreated across the river with the specific intention of reassessing an engagement, returning. These decisions could not be delegated to a Securitron whose architecture prevented it from refusing any suggestion. They required the kind of sustained attention and accumulated institutional knowledge that takes years to develop, and that the independent territory's new arrangement had approximately none of. What the independent future had, in place of institutional knowledge, was openness. It had not yet decided what it was going to be, which meant it had not yet committed to the specific failures that decisions produce. Whether that openness was an advantage or simply a more honest description of the uncertainty that every post-war governing arrangement contained was a question that the territory's first years would begin to answer. Through all four versions of the Mojave's future, certain things remained constant in the way that things remain constant when they are not actually dependent on the larger outcomes surrounding them. The artillery at Nellis continued discouraging approach from the open ground surrounding the base. The community inside continued its maintenance work, its greenhouse operations, its careful stewardship of aircraft that were being restored toward the aspiration of flight. The battle's outcome had registered inside Nellis as information rather than instruction. The Boomers had noted what had happened at the dam and had continued doing what they had been doing because their relationship with the surrounding territory's governance had always been defined by the boundary their perimeter represented, rather than by any active engagement with what happened beyond it. At the old Mormon fort, the patient roster changed, but the clinic's fundamental operation did not. The followers treated whoever arrived. Their resources remained stretched. The specific mix of conditions they addressed shifted as the post-battle Mojave produced its particular categories of injury and illness trauma from the conflict's final weeks, disrupted supply chains, producing nutritional deficiencies in settlements that had depended on trade routes now under new management, the accumulated health consequences of years of inadequate medical access in communities the Republic's military presence had protected without meaningfully serving. Goodsprings existed at the same remove from the region's political center that it had always occupied. The settlement's small economy continued functioning around the resources available in its immediate vicinity. The Brahmin, on the Ivanpah dry lake bed, provided what Brahmin had always provided to settlements that kept them: The water pump near the town's center continued its slow mechanical rhythm. The saloon opened and closed on a schedule determined by its owner's assessment of when customers were likely to be present. These communities had been present before any of the forces that had contested the dam's control had arrived in the region. They remained present after. Their survival was not a consequence of the battle's outcome. It was a consequence of the accumulated practical knowledge and mutual obligation that had kept them functioning through the years when neither empire had offered anything resembling support. The small data storage device that had initiated the entire sequence, extracted from a courier's possession at the cost of 2 bullets and a shallow grave, carried through the strip's operations, eventually placed in the Lucky 38's mainframe, had completed its function. What it left behind was not itself, but the condition it had produced. A Securitron force that remembered its upgrade and operated accordingly. A set of political arrangements reshaped by its delivery, and a courier who had crossed the Nevada territory in its pursuit and had arrived at a position that no one designing the chip's manufacture had included in their original specifications. The delivery had been completed. Everything that followed from that completion was the story of the Mojave's next decade, which was a different story and one that the territory's communities would tell in their own time, in their own terms, without requiring a narrator. Ulysses had returned to the divide, or had not, depending on what the confrontation in the broken terrain had produced. His argument, the careful, difficult argument about what it meant to carry consequences without understanding them, had been made as precisely as he was capable of making it. Whether it had been received in the spirit in which it was offered was between him and the person he had been waiting in a landscape of nuclear storms to deliver it to. The question he had raised did not resolve when the conversation ended. It traveled with the courier into whatever the following years contained, sitting alongside the political decisions and the alliance negotiations and the practical work of whatever governing arrangement the independent territory was attempting to construct. It sat there the way genuine questions sit, not demanding an answer, simply present, occasionally surfacing when the circumstances made its relevance impossible to set aside. The post-battle Mojave was not a resolved place. It was a place that had survived a resolution and was now discovering what surviving resolutions requires. The Lucky 38's lights ran their programmed sequence through the Nevada night, with the consistency of something that had been doing this for longer than any living person in the surrounding territory had been alive. The pattern had been set before the bombs. It had run through the silence that followed them, through the 2 centuries of desert dark, during which the city below the tower had emptied and refilled and reorganized itself around new economies and new hierarchies and new understandings of what a city in the middle of a hostile landscape was actually for. It had run through the political contest that had compressed itself into the events of 2281, and it continued running after. That contest had produced its conclusion, whatever conclusion it had produced, with the same indifference to outcomes that automated systems maintain when the people who designed them are no longer available to instruct them otherwise. Robert House was still available. He had simply concluded that the pattern did not require his attention to continue, which was true, and that his attention was better directed toward the calculations that the post-battle territory required, which was also true, and which was the complete extent of his relationship with the aesthetic of the thing he had preserved. The tower stood, as it had always stood, a vertical assertion in a horizontal landscape, its presence visible from a distance that made it the first thing travelers approaching from any direction identified as a fixed point. It was a landmark before it was anything else, a lighthouse without water, marking a location that the surrounding territory organized itself around, whether or not the organizing was intentional, whether the statement it represented the statement that something built before the fire could outlast the fire and continue standing afterward was inspiring or merely accurate, depended on what the person observing it needed. it to be. Generations after the battle at the dam, the territories that had contested the Mojave's future had continued developing in directions that the combatants of 2281 could not have predicted with confidence and would not have predicted without bias. The new California Republic's story acquired an ending that its founding generation had not written into any of the documents they had assembled with such care from recovered pre-war texts. Shady Sands, the settlement of tents around a vault dweller's agricultural knowledge, the town that had grown into a capital, the origin point of the most sustained attempt at democratic reconstruction in the post-war American West, was gone. A crater occupied the space where the settlement had been, and the crater had the specific character of craters produced by nuclear devices, rather than the gradual subsidence that time and neglect produce in abandoned places. The weapon that had produced it had not been fired in the context of the Republic's ongoing conflicts. The destruction of Shady Sands was connected, through chains of decision and concealment that post-war investigators would spend years attempting to reconstruct, to the corporate planning that Vault-Tec had been conducting in the years before the bombs, to a set of intentions regarding the post-war world that the company's public communications had not reflected, and that its Vault program had been designed, in part, to serve. The NCR's ending was not a defeat in any conventional military sense. It was the delayed arrival of a consequence that had been set in motion before the Republic existed. The soldiers who had held the dam, who had run their patrols through McCarran's converted terminal, who had sent their irregular pay back to families in California settlements, that were now themselves struggling with the specific instabilities that the Republic's collapse produced. Those soldiers had not anticipated this. They had believed they were fighting for something durable. The belief had been sincere. The sincerity had not been sufficient to make the thing they were fighting for durable. New Vegas appeared in the television record of this later period as a place that had survived in the particular way that places survive when they are not primarily dependent on the political arrangements surrounding them for their continued existence. The Strip's casinos were operating. The Lucky 38 was present, its lights running their sequence. The Securitrons maintained their patrols with the consistency of systems that had been running long enough that their operational parameters had become as much a part of the landscape as the buildings they moved between. The city had been shaped by whatever the post-battle decades had produced, and it carried that shaping in the specific way that places carry the accumulated weight of their history, not visibly, not through monuments or commemorations, but in the texture of daily life and the particular orientations that residents and visitors alike adopted toward the environment they occupied. House was present within the Lucky 38 inches, the way he had always been present, as a face on screens, a voice through speakers, a mind accessible through terminal interfaces, that the building's various levels provided to those with the appropriate access. His pre-war memories of Las Vegas as a functioning city, as a place with a population that had not yet been reduced to the categories of survivor and combatant, where the entertainment infrastructure he had purchased actually served the entertainment purposes it had been built for, gave his isolation a texture that the political events of 2281 had not fully captured. He had been alone inside the tower for longer than the post-war world had existed as an organized entity. The loneliness was not something he acknowledged in any communication the outside world received from him. It was present anyway, in the way that conditions present in a system for long enough become structural rather than incidental. Cooper Howard, who had been a pre-war actor, who had become, through the specific mechanisms of radiation and time, something that the pre-war world had not had a category for, arrived in the city, carrying the weight of his own two-century relationship with what had been lost. He had known Las Vegas when it was the city House had purchased. He had been part of the pre-war world, whose ending House had correctly predicted. His arrival at the Strip carried a different quality of recognition than any post-war visitor could bring. Not the recognition of someone encountering a preserved relic, but of someone encountering a place they had known before it became a relic. assessing the distance between what it had been and what it was now, with the attention of someone for whom that distance was personal. The city that resulted from these presences, house inside his tower, the strip operating below him, the post-dam decades, having produced whatever they had produced in the surrounding territory, was the same city that it had always been in its fundamental character. It had survived because House had calculated that it should. It continued because the infrastructure he had built was substantial enough to persist through political changes that had consumed more obviously powerful institutions. It was what it was, a preserved fragment of the old world, functional and strange, and entirely itself. The question that the New Vegas story had always been asking was not complicated to state, though it was resistant to simple answers. The NCR had been built by people who believed that the pre-war world's best ideas, democratic representation, rule of law, the protection of individual rights through institutional structures, were worth reconstructing from the materials available in the post-war landscape. They had been right about the ideas. They had underestimated the difficulty of separating the ideas from the systems that had produced them, which had also produced the conditions that ended the old world, and which had a tendency to reassert themselves whenever the institutional conditions were sufficiently similar. Caesar had been built by a man who believed that the pre-war world's failure was inherent in its structure rather than incidental to it, that democracy was not a good idea imperfectly executed, but a bad idea whose execution was irrelevant. He had been rigorous in his analysis and selective in his sources, and had built an organization that would not survive him in the form he had given it, which was an outcome that his own framework, applied honestly, would have identified as predictable. House had been built by a man who had converted himself into the purest possible expression of a single sustained intention, and had succeeded in that conversion so completely that nothing remained that could have been altered by the two. Centuries it had taken for the intention to reach its conclusion. What he had built would last. What it would mean to the people living inside it was a question his architecture had not included. The Courier had been built by a bullet they had survived, and a trail they had followed, and a set of choices made in a desert by a person who had no memory of who they were before the grave, and had to decide who they would be after it. They had been the most contingent of all the forces that converged on the dam in 2281, the variable that no one's planning had adequately incorporated, the element that every faction had attempted to use, and that had turned out to be capable of refusing to be used. Their story was the New Vegas story, in the way that one thing can be the story of another without being a summary of it, not because the Courier's choices determined everything, but because a story about a place needs a person moving through it, and the person who moved through this place had survived being discarded and had used the survival to determine what the discarded were owed. The Nevada night held its particular quality long after the events of 2281 had become the past that the following decades built on top of. The sand retained its heat through the hours after sunset, in the way that dense material retains what it has absorbed slowly, thoroughly, releasing it into the air above with the patience of something that is in no hurry. The stars over the desert were visible with a clarity that the pre-war world had not offered, the absence of competing light sources having restored to the night sky a depth that human beings had been obscuring for centuries before the bombs removed, the obscuring infrastructure along with everything else. Along the old highway routes, the signage of the pre-war roadside economy still stood at intervals: motel signs, gas station brand names, billboard frameworks that had held their advertisements through the initial blast waves, and then, through 2 centuries of desert wind, their surfaces reduced to the particular condition of things that have been weathered past their intended lifespan into something that has more in common with geology than with commerce. They mark the roads without communicating anything. The roads currently required marking for. They were present because nothing had removed them, and nothing had removed them because nothing had needed to. The desert was full of this kind of presence, things that remained because the conditions for their removal had not been met, carrying the memory of their original purpose in their physical form, while serving no current function except the passive one of being evidence that something had preceded what was here now. The highway motels and the gas stations and the billboards and the pre-war construction plaques on the dam's face and the bronze memorial register of workers' names, all of it was evidence, durable and mute, of the civilization that had produced it and that had also produced the conditions of its own ending. New Vegas remained in the middle of all this evidence, lit from within, running its sequences, administering its economy and its politics and its complicated relationship with the territory surrounding it, through whatever mechanisms the post-battle decades had refined into operational forms. It had survived. The survival was real and continued, and was not contingent on any particular narrative about why the survival had occurred or what it demonstrated. The city was there. The lights were on. The river was moving through the canyon below the dam's face at the same rate it had moved through that canyon for considerably longer than the dam had been there to channel it. Whatever the desert remembered about what had happened across it, the movements and decisions and arguments and losses that the years between 2077 and the present had accumulated into the specific history of this specific place it held in the way that deserts hold things, completely, without comment, available to anyone who looked with sufficient attention and patience and willingness to find what was actually there, rather than what they had arrived expecting to see. The lights ran their pattern through the dark. The sand held its heat. The stars remained.